everybody. So we're into the live streams now. Back in business with the live streams. So I figured I'd do a little book reading for everybody with philosophy because I did some research on philosophy for the past few months. And I want to pour out all that research for the audience. Do a little book reading and book tie-ins. So we're going to start with Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian. He's at the top of the internet, Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And since we're starting here first, let's start with the first cause argument. The first cause argument, perhaps the simplest and easiest to understand, is the argument of the first cause. It is maintained that everything we see in this world has a cause, and as you go back in the chain of causes further and further, you must come to a first cause, and to that first cause you get a name of God. That argument, I suppose, does not carry very much weight nowadays, because in the first place, cause is not quite what it used to be. The philosophers and the men of science have got going on cause, and it has not anything like the vitality it used to have. But apart from that, you can see that the argument that there must be a first cause is one that cannot have any validity. I may say that when I was a young man, I was debating these questions very seriously on my mind. I for a long time accepted the argument of the first cause, until one day at the age of 18, I wrote John Stuart Mill's autobiography, and I there found this sentence. My father taught me that the question, who may be, cannot be answered. So it immediately suggests a further question, who may God? That very simple sentence showed me, as I still think, the fallacy in the argument of the first cause. If everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. If there could be anything without a cause, it may just as well be the world as God. So there cannot be any validity in that argument. It is exactly the same nature as the Hindus' view, that the world rested upon the elephant, and the elephant rested upon the tortoise. And when they said, how about the tortoise, the Indians said, suppose we change the subject. The argument is really no better than that. There is no reason why the world could not have come into being without a cause, nor on the other hand, is there any reason why it should not have always existed. There's no reason to suppose that the world had a beginning at all. The idea that things must have a beginning is really due to the poverty of our imagination. Therefore, perhaps I need not waste any more time upon the argument about the first cause. Now to the God equation. However, in Buddhism, there is no God. The universe had no beginning or end. There's only timeless nirvana. All right, now, does God exist? The second way is from the nature of the efficient cause. In the world of sense, we find there is an order of efficient causes. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself. First so, it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Now, inefficient causes is not possible to go into infinity, because in all efficient causes following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. Now, to take away the causes, take away the effect. Therefore, if there be no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate nor any intermediate cause. But if inefficient causes is possible to go into infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect nor any intermediate efficient causes. All of which is plainly false. Therefore, it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name of God. Here's the thing, Lucy, and I'd be surprised if you didn't see this coming. If everything needs a cause, who calls God? Why is God the exception? Where does St. Thomas say that everything needs a cause? That's kind of the point of the argument, no? No. Thomas isn't saying whatever is needs a cause. He's saying whatever is caused by another. His point is that an infinite regress of causes dependent on other causes will not explain the effect we observe. So there must be a first cause that is uncaused, which we call God. He's still going on about this infinite regress stuff. Honestly, the argument sounds like a less convincing and way more confusing version of William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, except whereas Craig talks about time, Thomas talks about causes. Well, the difference between Craig and Thomas is that Craig believes that one can give philosophical arguments for the beginning of the universe. Thomas doesn't. Really, Aquinas believes the world began to exist because of divine revelation. The Bible teaches it. But he does not think you can prove the universe had a beginning philosophically. And of course, Big Bang cosmology wasn't a thing in Thomas's day. All the 5 ways, including this one, do not assume the universe had a beginning. Okay. Dave Ramsey Steele picked up on that one. Thomas Aquinas laid out 5 ways of proving the existence of God. The first 3 of these are forms of the cosmological argument, yet Aquinas never endorsed the first cause argument. Now I'm going to correct David Ramsey still a little bit here. He never endorsed the first cause argument like Craig's. He did endorse the first cause argument, though. Catholics are obliged to believe that the existence of God can be proved by reason alone, and this Aquinas accepted. But he maintained that it is impossible to prove the finite duration of the universe, though accepted it because the Church taught it. Aquinas therefore intended all three of his cosmological arguments to work even if the universe has been going on forever. The classic detailed examination of Aquinas' 5 ways is by Anthony Kinney. He concludes that all 5 arguments as Aquinas framed them failed. And this verdict is now generally accepted even by most Christian philosophers. More credence has been given to the cosmological argument as propounded by Leibniz and by Samuel Clarke, both improved versions of Aquinas' 3rd way. This approach is called the argument from contingency. The argument from contingency. The first cause argument is easy to grasp. The argument from contingency is more elusive and has carried more weight with philosophers and theologians. Many things we observe are contingent, that is to say, although they exist, we can easily imagine them not existing. This seems to be true of all specific arrangements of matter. The Taj Mahal exists, but there seems to be no problem in supposing that they do not exist. The argument goes on to assert that a full explanation of contingent things cannot be given purely in terms of contingent things. For example, suppose the entire universe were just an evolving collection of contingent things. Each contingent thing could perhaps be explained in terms of other contingent things, but the whole universe would lack an explanation. At this point, the argument appeals to something called the principle of sufficient reason, a principle that used to be accepted by many philosophers, but is now accepted by very few. The principle of sufficient reason says that nothing can exist without a sufficient reason for its existence. Therefore, the argument continues, there has to be at least one necessary thing, and there are no prizes for guessing who that's going to turn out to be. Everyone who makes a distinction between contingent and necessary things agrees that the difference between necessary and contingent is the difference between the way things have to be and the way things happen to be. But what does this really mean? Is it true that all objects are either contingent or necessary? And if so, how do we tell the difference? How do we know that the Taj Mahal is not necessary? Suppose the determinism were true, in which case the Taj Mahal and every other existent object would be strictly required by the Big Bang. The proponent of the contingency argument would still deny that the Taj Mahal was necessary. But if the Taj Mahal is not necessary, which, regardless of whichever theory of causation we adopt, then how can there be such a thing as a necessary thing? We can easily imagine the Taj Mahal not existing, but we could just as easily imagine God not existing. There is indeed one neat way to make this distinction. It solves a lot of problems, but it turns out to be devastating for the argument from contingency. This is the division between matters of logic and matters of fact, not decidable by logic alone. It is a matter of logic that a white rabbit is a rabbit, but it is a question of fact, which logic alone cannot settle, whether there is a white rabbit in downtown Chicago. David Hume, unfortunately David Hume was a racist, but the philosophy, I guess, is distinct from the racism. Just thought I'd point that out because race matters. We're going to get to that later. Shame on David Hume for being racist. David Hume pioneered the view that what is necessary is what is logically necessary, and nothing else is necessary at all. If what is necessary is what is logically necessary, would it be self-contradictory to deny? Then what is contingent is what can be asserted or denied without self-contradiction. If we adopt this approach, then strictly speaking, necessary and contingent do not apply to things but only to statements, because logic applies only to statements. However, these terms can be extended things by applying them to the statements that such or such a thing exists. So, if the Taj Mahal is contingent, this means that the statement that the Taj Mahal exists is not a truth of logic, which is certainly correct. If God is necessary, this means that the statement God exists is a truth of logic, which means that if you deny it, you contradict yourself. This is what the ontological argument tries to show. But the ontological argument is a failure. There's no self-contradiction in denying that God exists. Back to the God equation. Immanuel Kant found the flaw in the ontological proof because perfection and existence are two separate categories. To be perfect does not necessarily imply that something must exist. All right, we're going to focus a little more on that ontological argument with a religion. All pulse. All right, ontological argument and logical abracadabra. Ontology is the area of philosophy concerned with the abstract nature of being, and the ontological argument is one of the strangest and most logically convoluted of the arguments for existence of God. It strikes me as a form of theological sleight of hand, a pulling of God out of a top hat. For this reason, I'll deviate from my practice to beginning with a sketch of the argument in question, and instead first give something of the argument's flavor by briefly examining a few marginally related logical oddities. What is the following dialogue found in Plato's Euthydemous? Does he have a dog? Yes, a villain of one. And he has puppies? Yes, and they're very like himself. And the dog is not yours? To be sure, he is mine. Then he is a father, and he is yours. Therefore, he is your father, and the puppies are your brothers. This is an intentionally silly argument, but how does this logic differ from the following? Fido is a dog, Fido is yours, therefore Fido is your dog. The same grammatical structure seems unobjectionable in the latter case. An equally flawed equivocation is expressed by the logicians Semremi and Smallian, who argues, some cars rattle, my car really is some cars, so no wonder my car rattles. The ontological argument also brings to mind paradoxes of self-reference that date back to Stoic logicians of the 4th and 5th centuries BCE. The oldest, best-known such paradox concerned Epimenides the Cretan, who stated all Cretans are liars. The crux of the so-called liar paradox is clear if we simplify his statement to, I am lying, or better yet, this sentence is false. To spell this out a bit more, we'll give the label Q to this sentence is false. Now, we notice that if Q is true, then by what it says, it must be false. On the other hand, if Q is false, then what it says is true, and Q must then be true. Hence, Q is true if and only if it's false. Certainly a strange Ferris wheel of a statement. The statement Q and variants of it are arguably intimately connected with some of the deepest and most important ideas in logic and philosophy, and possibly even with consciousness itself. Despite this, they are often dismissed as pointless diversions, suitable only for amusing logicians and other literal-minded geeks. I must admit that on some days I feel the same way. Since this certainly is someday, I will, as a last preliminary to the ontological argument, describe the abracadabra argument for God. That is, I'll demonstrate how a relative of Q can be used to prove God's existence. Consider the two sentences below. 1. God exists. 2. Both these sentences are false. The second sentence is either true or false. If we assume it's true, then by what it says, both sentences are false. In particular, the second sentence is false. The only way the second sentence can be false is for the first sentence to be true. Thus, in this case, God exists. On the other hand, if we assume directly that the second sentence is false, then again we must note that the only way for this to be so is for the first sentence to be true. Thus, in this case also, God exists, hence God exists. Of course, in a similar way, we can demonstrate that God had a hangout, or that he doesn't exist, or that George W. Bush is in love with Britney Spears. A related self-referential trick can be pulled with the following statement, which we'll symbolize by S. If this statement is true, then God exists. Now, let's temporarily assume that statement S is true. What can we conclude from our assumption? Well, if S is true, then by what it says, we conclude that God exists. You might object that we just assumed that S was true and can't be certain of its truth. But re-examine what we've demonstrated. We're showing that if S is true, then God exists. But this is precisely what S says, and so S is true and God exists. Unfortunately, the same sort of approach can be taken with the statement T. If the statement is true, then God doesn't exist. This time would have proved that God doesn't exist. One resolution to these paradoxes is to be aware of the way statements can be layered. That is, we must carefully distinguish statements such as, the election was stolen, or Henry says he's sick, from meta-statements about these statements, such as, the candidate's claim of impropriety was unfounded, or Gertrude believes that Henry is exaggerating how bad he feels. This distinction leads us back to Russell's theory of types, and everything that grew out of it, and alas, away from the matters at hand. Enough fun and games! Finally, on to the more serious ontological argument for the existence of God, which is generally attributed to Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury in the 11th century. A very rough version of this argument defines God to be the greatest and most perfect possible being. It continues by assuming that this most perfect being must possess all characteristics of perfection. Since it's better to exist than not to exist, existence is a characteristic of perfection. Hence, in presto, God exists by definition. Let's hop into a little bit of the history of Christian theology. My boy Plato. Scholars and lovers. The most original thinker of the 11th century, Anselm, a monk who was born in Italy and educated in France, and who ended his life as Archbishop of Canterbury, illustrates monastic theology at its best. He stood firmly in the Augustinian tradition, believing that faith must precede understanding. Unless you believe, he insisted, you will not understand. For I do not seek to understand in order to believe, but I believe in order to understand. For I believe in this, that I shall not understand unless I believe. Only faith in Christ provides a perspective from which one can see the world aright. At the same time, Anselm saw few limits to what reason could do, what it could achieve when guided by faith. His ontological argument for the existence of God, for instance, has fascinated philosophers ever since. Ontology refers to the study of being, and the ontological argument rests on an analysis of God's being. Aquinas and Kant attacked this argument. Descartes and Leibniz defended it. And the debate continues. Given Bertrand Russell's fame as an atheist, I cannot resist quoting him. One day in 1894, as I was walking along Trinity Lane, I saw, in a flash, I saw that the ontological argument is valid. I'd gone out to buy a tin of tobacco. On my way back, I suddenly threw it up in the air and exclaimed as I caught it, "Great Scott! The ontological argument is sound!" And he later recovered. Several recent commentators have argued that Anselm actually presented two different arguments, but their case becomes fairly technical and does not concern the relation of faith and reason, which is under discussion here. Anselm began with the assumption that even those who deny God's existence must have some idea of what the word God means. Otherwise, how can they know what they are denying? If atheists and skeptics know what God means, then God exists in their understandings. Among other things, everyone understands God to be something than which nothing greater can be thought. We cannot conceive of anything greater than God. Anselm further assumed that it is greater to exist in reality than merely to exist in the understanding. For instance, this is not an example, tornadoes represent a greater danger to the house than dragons do. Not because dragons are without destructive force, but because dragons exist only in human imaginations, while tornadoes, alas, exist in reality as well. From these assumptions, the argument follows. 1. Something than which nothing greater can be thought exists in the understanding. Even the atheist knows what God means. 2. It is greater to exist in reality than merely to exist in the understanding. 3. Suppose that something than which nothing greater can be thought existed only in the understanding. Then it would be possible to think of something even greater, namely an entity otherwise identical which also existed in reality. 4. But this is impossible, since by definition it is impossible to think of something greater than something than which nothing greater can be thought. 5. Therefore something than which nothing greater can be thought must exist in reality as well as in the understanding. 6. Since God is something than which nothing greater can be thought, God exists in reality. The argument leaves many readers uncomfortable. We're uncomfortable, folks. One has a sense of being tricked. But even trained logicians cannot agree on where or whether it goes wrong. For nearly 1,000 years now, Anselm's interpreters have debated not only about whether he succeeded, but also about what he sought to accomplish. He seems to be offering an argument that should persuade even the atheists, yet the argument comes in the context of a prayer, and Anselm always retained his Augustinian conviction that faith must precede understanding. All right, History of Christian Theology. Picked that one up at Bright Light Books, Orlando. I'm looking on that. All right, here's what Mr. John Allen Paulos has to say. As with some other alleged proofs for the existence of God, this one proves too much. Paul's got uncomfortable. Proves too much. Even Gonolo, one of Anselm's contemporaries, notes this. Gonolo asks us to imagine the most perfect island conceivable, the island than which no greater island can be conceived. The same argument as above now demonstrates that this most perfect island must exist. My candidate for most perfect island would be Mount Desert Island in Maine, where I'm writing this. It's not perfect, but riding a bike along the ocean drive with my wife, or watching our daughter juggle rubber chickens and our son make a raging campfire is probably as close to perfect as it gets. More generally, variants of Noah's argument can be used to prove the existence of all manner of perfect entities. Of course, someone committed to the ontological argument can reply that islands and the like are not such things that can be perfect, and ideals of perfection vary from person to person. The abstract notion of a being, the argument goes, does admit of absolute perfection. But does it really? And is existence even a characteristic in anything like the same way that red or heart is? Even the French philosopher Descartes, remember that? Yeah, here's a good theology. Even the French philosopher Descartes subscribes to a version of the ontological argument. It derives from his conviction that he has an idea of God as a perfect being. This idea must have as a cause something external to him, since he is not perfect. Therefore, Descartes concludes, the only possible cause for his having this idea is an external, perfect being. God. Almost like caricature of Descartes' version of the ontological argument, as well as a nice twist on his I think therefore I am. It's a paraphrase of a passage from Donald Harrington's cult novel, The Architecture of the Arkansas Ozarks. And someone argues, I'm tickless, therefore I exist. I can't tickle myself, therefore you exist. Although more serious, Anselm's argument and developments and refinements of it, even that of the logician Kurt Gödel, seem to have the same level of persuasive power as the abracadabra argument mentioned above. As David Hume observed, as racist scum preserved, the only way a proposition can be proved by logic in the meaning of words alone is for its negation to be or lead to a contradiction. But there's no contradiction that results from God's unexisting. I mean, when you're right, you're right. Just like Thomas Jefferson, huh? Racist. But it needs to be called out. We're going to race matters later. Relevant to further development of this idea is the well-known philosophical distinction between analytic and synthetic statements. Analytic truth is one that is true by virtue of the meanings of the words it contains, and a synthetic truth is one that is true by virtue of the way the world is. Examples include bachelors are unmarried men versus bachelors are lascivious men, or UFOs are flying objects that have not been identified versus UFOs contain little green men. When Molaire's pompous doctor announces that the sleeping potion is effective because of its dominant virtue, he's making an empty analytic statement, not a factual synthetic one. This analytic synthetic distinction is the switching up of Immanuel Kant's original one, which in turn derives from related distinctions attributed to Hume and Gottfried Leibniz. Some philosophers, in particular the American philosopher W.B. Quine, have argued that the distinction is not hard and clear, but rather one of the greater convenience. It is, even not absolute and immutable, still a useful distinction. Okay, so there's a part here that talks about God's omnipotence. I'm actually going to save that for later, because we're going to get into that later when we get to the suicide. And when we get to that, I have to make it clear to everybody, please do not do it. But in philosophy class, we're going to talk about it. There is no way to conclusively disprove the existence of God. The reason is a consequence of basic logic, but is not one from which theists can take much heart. In fact, existential statements, those asserting that there is a non-mathematical entity having a certain property or set of non-contradictory properties, can never be conclusively disproved. No matter how absurd the existence claim, there exists a dog who speaks perfect English, ever swear in. Speaks perfect English, ever swear in. Now, what if this dog exists, right? But it lacks physical strength, right? I want to say it, sorry, I don't want to. He or she, the dog lacks physical strength, right? And it just couldn't help it. It has to speak perfect English, ever swear in. That's just its nature. It has to do that. But let's say that this dog is more powerful in spirit, right? Than the dog that speaks perfect English out of its mouth. Because the dog that speaks perfect English out of its mouth, he sure doesn't know how to talk. But he's speaking out of his ass. Meanwhile, when it speaks out of their ass, speaking from the mouth, speaking from the heart, speaking from the soul, the sword of the mouth. There we go. No matter how absurd the existence claim, there exists a dog who speaks perfect English out of his rear end. We can't look everywhere and check everything in order to assert with absolute confidence there is no entity having a property. Existence claims can, however, be proved simply by presenting an example of an entity possessing the property in question. In this case, a flashfully articulate canine pundit. By contrast, universalist statements, those asserting that every mathematical entity of a given type has a certain property, a set of non-contradictory properties, can't be conclusively proved. No matter how plausible the universal claim all emeralds are green, we can't look everywhere and check everything in order to assert with absolute confidence that all entities of a given type have the property. Universal claims can, however, be disproved simply by presenting a counterexample, a red emerald, an entity that doesn't have the property in question. So, did arguments and counterarguments in this book conclusively prove there isn't a God? No, of course not. But now there is an argument that conclusively proves there isn't a dog that speaks perfect English out of its rear end. Nor is there conclusive proof there isn't a Santa, a Satan, and he says a flying spaghetti monster here, but I have one I like better, the flying teapot. The invisible flying teapot on Earth. I like that better than the flying spaghetti monster. British culture is forever. Despite the vast difference in significance, gravitas, and resonance among these existence claims, they are all, by nature's logical form, incapable of being conclusively disproved. Finally, an apocryphal story illustrates the sometimes intimidating nature of logic and mathematics in these matters. Catherine the Great had asked the famous French philosopher Denis Diderot to her court, but was distressed to discover that Diderot was a vocal atheist. To counter him, she asked a visiting mathematician Holler to confront Diderot. Being told that there was a new argument for God's existence, the numerate Frenchman expressed a desire to hear it. Keep in mind for this Frenchman, we're going to get into a crazy Frenchman later. Oh my gosh. Get ready. It could knock your socks out. Like it did me. Oh shit. The Euler then short forward and seated. Sir, blah 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 equals et, hence God exists. Reply, having no understanding of math, Diderot is reported to have been so dumbfounded, he left for Paris. I seriously doubt the story. But it is perhaps suggestive of how easily nonsense, preferred in an earnest and profound manner, consistent browbeat someone in acquiescence. Yeah, nonsense. Okay. John Paulos. Gotta give credit to this dude. Every book I read, pick up these books, but I just want to tie these in, share the philosophy with him. Alright. Now back into the Steele. Alright. It does not look as if God exists as the truth of logic. Certainly no one has yet shown this, and might even be a truth of logic, that every existing entity exists contingently. Most people who still adhere to the concerns of the argument would dispute that necessary is confined to logically necessary. They would say that there are additional metaphysically necessary truths. I'm not sure that any good candidates have been proposed for these, but like truths of logic, they were presumably very general. It's difficult to see how the existence of a specific entity, like a disembodied person, could be metaphysically necessary. If all the same, we want to say that the universe might not have existed and depends for its existence on something else that could not fail to exist, then matter, energy, or quantum vacuum, or some even more fundamental physical condition, looks like the best bet. Oh, yeah, nobody's guessing what this is going to turn out to be, huh? You're an atheist, some more fundamental physical condition. Alright, Abraham the Steele. Pretty good book. And according to the person in the back, James Sadowski, Atheism Explained is a much better defense of atheism than the recent works by Dawkins and Hitchens. Now, Dawkins, yes, because Dawkins is an incest defender. Yeah, look it up on Paying Burn. Dawkins is just a dead-ass incest defender. Two sisters marrying, what's wrong with that? Just as bad as Singer defending bestiality. What is wrong with you? That's what I say to Richard Dawkins and Peter saying, what is wrong with you? You get slapped. You know, they need to get slapped. Meanwhile, Hitchens goes on stage and speaks against incest. Hitchens, I love. That's a great one. He's my favorite of the movement. Him and Daniel Dennett. Only ones you need in my opinion if you ask me out before horse in the new atheist movement. Hitchens and Dennett. Thumbs up. Thumbs up. So that is, you could say it's more philosophical than Hitchens, because Hitchens, he did his philosophy and stuff, but I do think he was more of an intellect than a philosopher. I think there's a little bit of a difference. Okay. Remember the crazy French guy I was talking about earlier? Oh my gosh. G. Missler. Oh my gosh. The dude lost me followers on Instagram. But hear him out. Ready? This is, in my opinion, one of the biggest atheist thinkers. So, here's a little background on this. This is what's so interesting about it. I'm gonna read it back a bit, because this dude always excites me, dude. This is like the atheist OG. Crazy first dude. Beginning in 1689. Jean Missler worked for around 40 years as a priest of the small town of Etre-Pigny, France. When he died, his parishioners were astonished to find his last testament to them, a refutation of every religious doctrine he had advocated in life. This is the testament with preface of whole terror, who exhorted his own daughter to read again and again and again. All work and no play. All work and no play. It's like a very old boy. Oh boy, I have to read it again and again and again. Okay. You ready? Let's get into it. The world has not been created, and matter moves by itself. They tell us gravely that there is no effect without a cause. They tell us very often that the world did not create itself, but the universe is a cause and not an effect. It is not a work, has not been made, because it was impossible that it should be made. The world has always been, its existence is necessary, it is the cause of itself. Nature, whose essence is visibly acting and producing in order to fulfill her functions, as we see she does need an invisible motor far more unknown than herself. Matter moves by its own energy, but a necessary result of its heterogeneity. The diversity of its movements or of its ways of acting constitute only the diversity of substances. We distinguish one being from another, but by the diversity of the impressions or movements which they communicate to our organs. Continuation. You see that everything in nature is in a state of activity. And you pretend that nature of itself is dead and without energy. You believe that all this acting of itself has need of a motor. Well, who is this motor? It is a spirit that is to say an absolutely incomprehensible and contradictory being. Conclude then, I say to you, that matter acts of itself, and cease to reason about your spiritual motor, which has nothing that is necessary to put it into motion. Return from your useless excursions. Come down from the imaginary, oh no, let your imagination soar, oh no, into a real world, oh no, no. Take hold of second causes. Leave the theologians their first cause, of which nature has no need in order to produce all the effects which you see. Other proofs that motion is in the essence of matter, and that it is not necessary to suppose a spiritual motor. It is but by the diversity of impressions or of effects which substances or bodies make upon us that we feel them, that we have perceptions and ideas of them, that we distinguish them one from another, that we assign to them peculiarities. Moreover, in order to perceive or to feel an object, this object must act upon our organs. This object cannot act upon us without exciting some motion in us. It cannot produce any motion in us if it is not itself in motion. Whoa, okay. As soon as I see an object, my eyes must be struck by it. I cannot conceive of light and a vision without a motion in the luminous extended and colored body, which communicates itself to my eye, which acts upon it right now. As soon as I smell a body, my olfactory nerve must be irritated and put in motion by the parts itself from the odorous body. As soon as I hear a sound, the tympanum of my ear must be shut by the air put in motion by his body, which could not act if it was not moved of itself. For which it follows evidently that without motion I can neither feel, see, distinguish, compare, nor judge body, nor even occupy my thought with any matter whatever. It is said in the schools that the essence of being is that from which flow all the properties of that being. Now then, it is evident that all the properties of bodies or of substances of which we have ideas are due to motion, which alone informs us of their existence and gives us the first conceptions of it. I cannot be informed or assured of my own existence, but by the motions which I experience within myself. I am compelled to conclude that motion is as essential to matter as its extension, and that it cannot be conceived of without it. If one persists in cavilling about the evidences which prove to us that motion is an essential property of matter, he must at least acknowledge that substances that seem dead or deprived of all energy take motion of themselves as soon as they're brought with their properties act upon each other. Proper porous, when enclosed in a bottle or deprived of contact with the air, cannot take fire by itself, but it burns as soon as exposed to the air. Flour and water cause fermentation as soon as they're mixed. Thus, dead substances enjoy motion of themselves. Matter has then the power to move itself, and nature nor the act does not need a motor whose essence would hinder its activity. The existence of man does not prove that of God. Whence comes man? What is his origin? Is he the result of the fortuitous meeting of atoms? Was the first man formed of the dust of the earth? I do not know. Man appears to me to be a production of nature, like all others she embraces. I should be just as much embarrassed to tell you whence came the first stones, the first trees, the first elements, the first ants, the first acorns, as to explain the origin of the human species. Recognize we are told the hand of God, of an infinitely intelligent and powerful workman, and a work so wonderful as the human machine. I would admit without question that the human machine appears to me surprising, but since man exists in nature, I do not believe it right to say that its formation is beyond the forces of nature. I will add that I can conceive far less of the formation of the human machine. When they explain it to me, they tell me that a pure spirit who has neither eyes, nor feet, nor hands, nor head, nor lungs, nor mouth, nor breath, has made man by taking a little dust and blowing upon it. The savage, St. Augustine tried that out. The savage inhabitants of Peru pretend to be descended from the moon and appear to us as simpletons. The theologians of Europe pretend to be descended from a pure spirit. Is this pretension more sensible? Man is intelligent, hence it is concluded that he must be the work of an intelligent being and not of a nature devoid of intelligence. Hence, nothing is more rare than to see man use his intelligence, of which he appears so proud. I will admit that he is intelligent, that is, necessities develop in him this faculty, that the society of other men contributes especially to cultivate it. But in the human machine and the intelligence which is endowed, I see nothing that shows in a precise manner the infinite intelligence of the workman who has the honor of making it. I see that this admirable machine is subject to derangement, that at the same time this wonderful intelligence is disordered, and sometimes only disappears. From this I conclude that human intelligence depends upon a certain disposition of the material organs of the body, and that because man is an intelligent being, it is not what to conclude that God must be an intelligent being, any more than because man is material, we are compelled to conclude that God is material. The intelligence of man never proves the intelligence of God, then the balance of men proves the knowledge of this God. If we then pretend that man is a work, in whatever way theology is taken, God will always be a cause contradicted by its effects, or of whom it is impossible to judge by his works. We shall always see evil, imperfections, and folly resulting from a cause claim to be full of goodness, of perfections, and of wisdom. Yo, mister, what is theology? Let's get into that a little more. What is theology according to mister? All right. What's theology? There is a science which has for its object only incomprehensible things. Unlike all others, it occupies itself with things unseen. Hobbes calls it the kingdom of darkness. In this land, all obey laws opposed to those which men acknowledge in the world they inhabit. In this marvelous region, light is but darkness, evidence becomes doubtful or false, the impossible becomes credible, reason is an unfaithful guide, and common sense changes into delirium. This science is codenamed theology. And this theology is a continual insult to human reason. Okay then. Wow, okay. So, okay, let's get that out. According to Mr. Theology is an insult to human reason. Wow, okay. So, he talks about the kingdom of darkness. Let's focus on that. We need to get to my favorite Christian, C.S. Lewis. And this is why I like Hitchens. Hitchens countered C.S. Lewis. God is not great. I'm going to get into this before I get to C.S. Lewis, because we're going to get to the shocking alternative. Hitchens countered C.S. Lewis, right? While still giving him credit, while still petting the lion's mane, giving him courage. I got to give him courage. This is what he says right here. I'm going to give him courage here. I'm going to give him honesty and some courage. So for that, you get exalted Hitchens for criticizing Lewis pretty well and giving him credit. even though I love Lewis, even though Hitchens is like not really my taste, but you know, that's just like, oh, you don't like the same bands. Oh no, you don't like the Chronicles of Narnia. Oh no, I can't like your book. This dude has very different opinions than me. This is like, to me, Hitchens is when a leftist understands the right. That's Hitchens. But let's get into the shocking alternative, shall we, Christians? Are the Christians watching? All right, C.S. Lewis. Okay, C.S. Lewis is alive. So I'm gonna get necessary to try, since Hitchens counting against it. Actually, no, Jesus is not good. I'm gonna counter it with the Missler, the Hitchens philosophical baggage. That's what I like to call it, Hitchens philosophical baggage. All right, let's get right into the shocking alternative. Christians then believe that an evil power has made himself for the present the prince of this world, and of course that raises problems. Is this state of affairs in accordance with God's will or not? If it is, he's a strange God, you will say. And if it is not, how can anything happen contrary to the will of a being with absolute power? But anyone who's been an authority in his thing can be in accordance with your will in one way and not in another. It may be quite sensible for a mother to say to the children, I'm not going to go make the title of the schoolroom every night. You've got to learn to keep a title on her own. Then she goes up one night and finds the teddy bear and the ink and the French grammar all lying in the grate. That is against her will. She would prefer the children to be tidy. But on the other hand, it is her will which has left the children free to be untidy. The same thing arises in a new regiment or trade union or school. You make a thing voluntary and then half the people do not do it. That is not what your will, but your will has made it possible. It is probably the same in the universe. God created things which had free will. That means creatures which can go either wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which was free, but had no possibility of going wrong. I cannot. Everything is free to be good, it's also free to be bad, and free will is what has made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will that makes evil possible is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness is well worth having. What if automated creatures like machines would hardly be worth creating? The happiness which God designs for his higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to him and to each other, and an ecstasy of love and delight, compared with which most rapturous love between a man and a woman on earth is milk and water. And for that they must be free. Of course, God knew what would happen if they used it in the wrong way. Apparently, he thought it worth the risk. Perhaps we feel inclined to disagree with him, but there is a difficulty about disagreeing with God. He is the source for which all your reasoning power comes. You cannot read right and be wrong any more than a shooting because your eye is higher than the sun's source. When you're arguing against him, you're arguing against the very power that makes you able to argue at all. It's like cutting off the branch you're sitting on. If God thinks instead of avoiding universal price worth faith for free will, that is, for making a live world in which creatures can do real good or harm, and something of real importance can happen, instead of a tour world which only moves when it pulls the strings, then we may take it is worth paying. Okay, so I'm going to try to counter you with David Jones is still there, Lewis. Mere atheism. He talks about them here, mere atheism. Okay. Well, if God's omnipotent, couldn't he have given people free will and at the same time guaranteed that they would, in fact, always make the right choices? Theists will generally deny that this is possible, but how can it be impossible? According to classical theism, God himself cannot possibly do anything evil. Theists also claim that God has free will. Hold up. God cannot possibly do anything evil. Are you sure about that? If God repented when he made Saul king, if God repented when he made man, did God do something evil? I'll leave that. Audience, if God combines free will with a guarantee against ever committing evil, then it cannot be impossible to combine free will with a guarantee against ever committing evil. God, if he decided to create other beings with free will, would also create them in his own image with a guarantee against ever committing evil. The theist just says that God has free will, and they nearly all do. Cannot claim that free will and a guarantee against committing evil are metaphysically incompatible, and will therefore find it hard to deny that God could have created humans with a guarantee against ever committing evil. A theist might respond to this: humans are not God, but something less. Still, something less is not possession of free will, so human free will doesn't explain why humans could have been made in such a fashion that they never made a more than wrong choice. What is the quality that God possesses, making it unthinkable for him to do any evil that could not have been conferred on humans God created him? Whatever it may be, it is not free will. Theists often claim that it is God's nature that rules out the possibility of his doing anything wrong. In that case, God should have created humans with a nature that ruled out the possibility of their doing anything wrong. If the reply is that they were so created, but that they succumbed to temptation and their nature turned evil because of his fall, then one day God might succumb to temptation and develop an evil nature. Or perhaps this happened long ago, and God defined as necessarily all good no longer exists. But if God could not possibly succumb to temptation, then humans are similar to type of intelligent creatures. Nothing is given by calling up the zoological category human could have been made so they cannot possibly succumb to temptation. I see no escape from the conclusion that if there is some quality of humans which made it impossible for them not to be guaranteed against making evil choices, that quality had to be something other than free will. Therefore, whatever reason God might have had for making humans in such a way that they'd be likely to cause a lot of evil, it was certainly not that he wanted them to have free will. Leaving aside the counterexample of God himself, that seemed obvious to many thinkers, both theists and atheists, that there is no problem about God giving his creatures free will and ensuring that they make only right choices. This position is suggested by compatibilism, which I explained above. It's also suggested by the view that God knows the future, foreseeing all outcomes from the beginning. The view that God foreknows everything that will happen may go along with determinism or within determinism. The idea that God might give people free will and ensure they always made right choices does not involve God giving anyone an irresistible psychological compulsions, Van Wagen terms as Seuss suppose. Everyone's decision between good and evil can be finally balanced, simultaneously, even one is going absolutely lacking in compulsiveness. But God, who in making the universe sees every single event in its entire history and all detail as one vast, though to God's on that especially vast tapestry taken in a glance, which is well into the existence of that universe. And when there, so to speak, if we imagine God consulting infinitely long list of every possible universe, one precisely specified universe, in which it happens to turn out to know which is evil. If determinism is correct, then there is no free will defense. This holds that there is no such thing as free will, and it also holds that there is no free will in determinism. If both human free will and metaphysical determinism are true, then God could both give people free will and set things up so they always make good choices. Therefore, anyone advancing the free will defense has to reject compatibilism, either both free will and determinism are true. Opponent of the free will defense has to accept free will and determinism. But even if there is no determinism, if God foresees everything, then there is still no free will defense. The view that God is outside time or outside our time, sees the whole space-time world as a simultaneous spot, with times again one spatial dimension, when they tell that God making the world intends every detail of it, including those that are not deterministically related to other details. Okay, I'll leave it up to honest how good that rejection was. I thought it was probably broken. I thought it was alright. I thought it was pretty good. Alright, back to Lewis. Actually, Lewis is going to address that, actually. Lewis listens. What may have understood about free will, David Ramsey Steele. We shall see how silly it is to ask, as somebody once asked me. Why did God make a creature such rotten stuff that went wrong? The better stuff a creature is made of, the cleverer and stronger it is, and the better if it goes right, but also the worse it will be if it goes wrong. A cow cannot be very good or very bad. A dog can be both better and worse, a child better and worse still, an ordinary man still more so, a man of genius still more so, a superhuman spirit best or worst of all. How did dark power go wrong? Here, no doubt, we ask the question which human beings cannot give an answer with any certainty. A reasonable traditional guess based on experiences of going wrong can however be offered. The moment we have a self at all, there's a possibility of putting yourself first, one to be sinner, one to be God in fact. That was the sin of Satan, and that was the sin of the human race. Some people think the fall of man has something to do with sex, but that is a mistake. It's from the book of Genesis where they suggest that some corruption in their sexual nature fall. The fall was as a result, as cause. What Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors was either they could be like gods, could set up their own as if they created themselves, be their own masters of some sort of happiness for themselves outside God, apart from God, and that hopeless attempt has come nearly all that we call human history. Money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empire, slavery. All in terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which would make him happy. The reason why I can never succeed is this. God made us. Invented us as a man invents an engine. A car is going to run on petrol and would not run properly on anything else. Now God designed the human machine to run on himself. He himself is the fuel, or the spirit was designed to burn, and the food or spirit was designed to feed on. There is no other. That is why there's just no God good, asking God to make us happy in our own way without bothering about religion. God cannot give us happiness and peace apart from himself because it is not there. There's no such thing. That is the key to history. Terrific energies expended, civilizations are built up, excellent institutions devise, but each time something goes wrong. Some fatal flaw always brings the selfish cruelty people to the top, and it all slides back in their misery and ruin. In fact, the machine conks, it seems to start up all right and runs a few hours, and then it breaks down. They're trying to run the wrong juice. That is what Satan is on those humans. And what did God do? First of all, he left this conscience, a sense of right and wrong, and all through history there have been people trying, some of them very hard to obey it. None of them ever quite succeeded. Secondly, he said the human race what I call good dreams. I mean, those square stories scattered all through the heathen religions about a God who dies and comes alive again, and by his death has somehow given new life to men. Thirdly, he selected one particular people and spent several centuries hammering into their heads the sort of God he was. That there was only one of him, and that he cared about right conduct. Those people were the Jews, and the Old Testament gives an account of the hammering process. Then comes the real shock. Among these Jews, there's certainly terms of a man who goes about talking as if he was God. He claims to forgive sins. He says he's always existed. He says he's someone who shows worldly enough time. Now let's get this clear. Among pantheists or the Indians, anyone might say there was a part of God or one with God. There would be nothing very odd about it. But this man, since he was a Jew, could not mean that kind of God. God in another language, but the being outside of what who made it was infinitely different from anything else. And when you have grasped that, you'll see that what this man said was quite simply the most shocking thing that has ever been uttered by human lips. Oh my gosh. One part claims tends to slip past us unnoticed because we have heard it so often that we no longer see what it amounts to. I mean, the claim to forgive sins, and he says, now unless the speaker is God, this is really so preposterous as to be comic. We can all understand how man forgives offenses against himself. You should remind him, and I forgive you. You steal my money, and I forgive you. But what should we make of man himself unrobbed and untrodden upon, who not see if he forgives you for stealing other men's money? Acid on the perpetuity is the kindest description we should give to his conduct. What would Nietzsche say about this? He said, I cannot believe in a God that offers forgiveness to all people. Yeah, this is what Jesus did. Unless he's speaking against the Holy Ghost. He told people that their sins were forgiven and never would consult all the other people whom their sins had undoubtedly injured. He unhesitatingly behaved as if he was the party chiefly concerned. Person chiefly offended in all offenses. This makes sense only if he really was the God whose laws were broken, whose love is rooted in every sin. In the mouth of any speaker who is not God, these words would imply what it can only regard as a silliness and conceit, unrivaled by any other character in history. Yet, and this is the strange significant thing, even his enemies, when they read the Gospels, do not usually get the impression of silliness and conceit. So let's do one prejudice readers. Christ says that he is humble and meek, And we believe him, not noticing that if you're merely man, humility, meekness are the very last characteristics we can show some of the sayings. Maybe a problem. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept this claim to be God. There's one thing we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said those sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on a level where the man who says he's a bookcheck, or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make a choice. Either this man was and is the son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You showed up for a fool, you experimented with killing as a demon, or he could have fallen at his feet and called Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about this being a great human teacher. He has not left it up to us. He did not intend to. Oh, shit. Okay. So, wow. Okay. We're going to try. What if Jesus was a maniac? Oh my gosh. So, we're going to pull out G-Mister. We're going to pull out G-Mister and atheism to the basics with my stop here. Okay. So, letters to young contrarian, right? Jesus is not good, as I said. Contrary to the apotheosis of Christ, the scriptural evidence suggests that Jesus was a despicable fanatic, lunatic, rogue, liar, and false prophet whose words and deeds are very unreliably recorded in the Gospels, which disagree on so many points of detail. The Catholic Church is vile, pernicious and wedded to observe dogma, e.g. the Trinity and tradition, e.g. Eucharist. They are plainly in conflict with an honest materialism. Finally, Christian morality loves and cherishes misery and suffering on the absurd grounds that this reflects the passion of Christ. It condemns desires, even though these are natural affections that conduce to the future existence of humanity. It surely commends continence and chastity when consenting adults should be free to engage in mutually chosen acts, even beyond the bounds of marriage. It causes great suffering for many women and children because it forbids divorce. This causes great suffering for animals because it teaches that we can do to them whatever we choose. It is surely commends for any other cheek and face of brutality and exploitation of the weak and vulnerable. It is complicit in the excesses of tyrants, parasitic nobles, and priestly enablers. And it is a counter-revolutionary force that endorses the status quo and gives general blessing to the reigning of injustice upon the lower classes by the upper classes. Misl's alternative to the Christian worldview is based upon a rather inchoate materialism that recognizes space, time, and matter as a fundamental ingredients of causal reality. According to the Missler, the primary cause of human suffering is that given food among a social organization, there are too many people competing for too few resources, a condition that might be ameliorated under a different distribution of wealth and property. Missler supposes that all people have rights to life, food, clothing, housing, healthcare, education, liberty, gainful employment, and freedom. Further, he supposes that under feudal as a social organization, there's a class struggle between, on the one hand, peasants and workers, and on the other hand, kings, nobles, judges, lawyers, priests, and the church. We desire to see the formal grovel being a primary determinant of class hatred. His favorite solution is revolution. The lower classes should simply stop paying taxes, refuse feudal rent, rebel against forced labor, abolish private property, and kill the enemies of humanity. Moreover, he thinks that this solution should be global. Everyone on the planet, the lower classes, should join the struggle that will end only when the last of the nobles, as it strangled with the intestines of the last priest. Finally, echoing other sentiments that subsequently emerged in the Enlightenment, Mr. notes that while intellectuals are not on the side of the peasants and the workers and are conspicuously absent from the companionship of the rest of the earth, the future for intellectuals is to join the class struggle on the side of the lower classes. Oingo boingo, capitalism keeps bouncing through my head with these words, man. Listen to that song. But we're gonna get, you know how great this is. We're gonna get we're just getting political now. All right, here's a little lesson. From the Communist Manifesto. According to Bertrand Russell, Marx, not inspired by kindly feeling. Not inspired by kindly feeling. On the contrary, the history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and gentleman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed. So in constant opposition to one another, carrying on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in a common ruin of the contending classes. Now, Wolf. Understanding Marxism. Let's understand that Marxism. Another remarkable quality of Marx's and many Marxist analyses, besides specific insights drawn from their surplus-focused analysis, is their attention to the contradictions. Beyond the tendencies they find shaping societies, they usually seek and find counteracting tendencies and likewise elements and subtle tendencies that push them in society in different and often clashing directions. This sensitivity to and interest in contradictions derives in part from Marx's teacher, the German philosopher Hegel. In Hegel's view, everything is contradictory. Everything in life, nature, society, etc., is a bundle of conflicting needs, forces, and pressures. Indeed, our thoughts about and knowledge of life are also inescapably contradictory. For Marx, capitalism too exemplifies its contradictions. As one example, Marx explains to us that every capitalist tries to get as much surplus from productive workers as possible. The more surplus is appropriated, the more can be distributed as dividends to keep shareholders happy, as high salaries to motivate managers, etc. The surplus distributions keep the capitalist system going, reinforcing the capitalist dominance. Since more surplus available to the capitalist is better, capitalists always seek more. Greed is not the cause of capitalist behavior. It is a quality they acquire in accommodating to and internalizing the requirements of competitive survival within a capitalist system. Let me repeat that, because you're about to get into C.S. Lewis again. Greed is not the cause of capitalist behavior. It is a quality they acquire in accommodating to and internalizing the requirements of competitive survival within the capitalist system. Nearly all those evils in the world which people put down to greed or selfishness are really far more the result of pride. Take it with money. Greed will certainly make a man want money for the sake of a better house, better holidays, better things to eat and drink, but only up to a point. What is it that makes a man with $10,000 a year anxious to get $20,000 a year? It is not the greed for more pleasure. $10,000 will give all the luxuries that any man can really enjoy. It is pride that wish to be richer than some other man, and still more the wish for power. For of course, power is what pride really enjoys. There's nothing makes a man feel so superior to others as being able to move them about like toy soldiers. What makes a pretty girl spread misery wherever she goes by collecting admirers? Certainly not her sexual instinct. That kind of girl is quite often sexually frigid. It is pride. What is it that makes a political leader or a whole nation go on and on, demanding more and more? Pride again. Pride is competitive by its very nature. That is why it goes on and on. If I'm a proud man, then as long as there is one man in the whole world more powerful or richer or cleverer than I, he's my rival and my enemy. The Christians are right. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. Other vices may sometimes bring people together. You may find good fellowship and jokes and friendliness among drunken people or unchaste people, but pride always means enmity. It is enmity. And not only enmity between man and man, but enmity to God. And God, you come up against something which is never respect and measurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God is that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you're proud, you can't know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. That raises a terrible question. How is it that people who are quite obviously eaten with pride can say they believe in God and consider themselves very religious? I'm afraid it means they are worshiping an imaginary God. They theoretically admit themselves to be nothing in the presence of this phantom God, but really all the time imagining how he proves them and thinks them far better than ordinary people. That is, they pay a pennyworth of imaginary humility to him and get out of it a pound's worth of pride towards their fellow men. I suppose it was what those people Christ was thinking when he said that some would preach about him and cast out devils in his name, only to be told at the end of the world that he never known them. And any of us may at any moment be in this death trap. Luckily, we have a test. Whenever we find that our religious life is making us feel very good above all, that we're better than someone else, I think we may be sure that we are being acted on. Not by God, but by the devil. Pride is the devil. J. Cole. Real test of being in the presence of God is that you either forget about yourself altogether or see yourself as a small, dirty object. It's better to forget about yourself altogether. It's a terrible thing. The worst of all the vices can smuggle itself into the very center of our religious lives, but you can see why. The other and less bad vices come from the devil working on us through our animal nature. But this does not come through our animal nature at all. It comes direct from hell. It's purely spiritual, consequently it is far more subtle and deadly. For the same reason, pride can often be used to beat down the simpler vices. Teachers, in fact, often appeal to a boy's pride, or as they call it, self-respect, to make him behave decently. Many a man has overcome cowardice or lust or ill temper by learning to think that they're beneath his dignity. That is by pride. The devil laughs. He is perfectly content to see you becoming chaste and brave and self-controlled, provided all the time he's studied and getting you the dictatorship of pride. Just as he would be quite content to see your children as cared if he was allowed in return to give you cancer. For pride is spiritual cancer. It gives up the very possibility of love or contentment or even common sense. All right, back to the Marxism. Capitalists may appropriate more surplus if they reduce workers' wages while getting the same output from them. There are alternative ways to accomplish such wage reductions. Immigration of lower wage workers is a famous phenomenon in capitalist societies past and present. So too is switching from one population group to another, for example, from men to women, from adults to children, from one ethnicity to another, and so on. Of course, both these wage reduction mechanisms entail contradictions, as displaced wage earners resent and resist. That may place new demands on capitalist surpluses, say to offset enterprise damage from angry displaced workers that nullify the gains from low wages and so on. Lower paid workers may display less loyalty to the enterprise. The contradictions about and may, depending on the larger social context, overwhelm the initial capitalist impulse tendency to low wages. Besides lowering wages, production costs may be reduced when capitalists can replace productive workers with machines. So automate, computerize, or robotize may be cheaper than, and therefore substitute for, hiring productive workers. However, no sooner do capitalists succeed in paying lower wages and or hiring fewer workers than they may well face another contradiction. The workers may now have less income than they had before because wages fell or automation hit. Thus, they will be less able to buy what capitalists need to sell. To benefit by lowering their outlays to workers, capitalists have inadvertently undermined the demand for their products. The virtually universal drive to economize on labor costs operates in contradiction to the parallel drive to sell all that is produced. The system is a contradiction. The very logic imposed on the capitalist undermines the overall success of the capitalist. For Marxists, no law, rule, regulation, or behavior pattern provides an escape from this contradiction. None ever has. Capitalism experiences this contradiction in the form of recurrent oscillations between periods of profit-boosting savings on labor costs and profit-busting inefficiencies of effective demand for capitalist products. That is how the system works. And of course, workers laid off because of automation or deficient demand may well worsen that deficiency and thereby produce a spiral downward into major recession or depression. Eventually, downturns produce a sufficient cheapening of labor power and produce inputs to enable capitalists to profit from resuming production. Then an upswing follows and repeats the same pattern of cyclical instability yet again. Because of this and other contradictions explored across the three volumes of Capital, the capitalist system is profoundly unstable. Every 4 to 7 years on average, wherever it has existed, capitalism produced an economic downturn. Workers suddenly lost jobs, businesses collapsed, and real mass suffering ensued for months or years. This instability occurred in addition to the destabilizing effects of natural disasters, floods, droughts, etc., and of social disasters, wars. Any individual exhibiting a personal instability comparable to the economic and social instability of capitalism would long ago have been required to seek professional help and to make basic changes. Marx's basic point is that capitalism produces and reproduces inequality and instability. That alone suggests we ought to challenge anyone who accepts a system that works this way. Through the work of Marx and others, we can now recognize capitalism's contradictions, plus the inadequacies and injustices they impose on us. It's precisely how the system works. In particular, it produces, appropriates, and distributes its surpluses that prove to be the obstacle preventing capitalism from realizing liberty, equality, brotherhood, and democracy. And my focus is on the organization of the surplus. Marx also provided us with the knowledge that the next system must be one in which the organization of the surplus is democratic, where those who produce the surplus are identical with those appropriated, and where the productive and unproductive laborers together and democratically decide who gets what portions of the surplus, therefore what social services. The philosophers have formally interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So yeah, we're talking politics and religion, my friend. All right. Now, some advice from my favorite conservative, far better than Donald Trump. That's me, Roger Scruton. There are philosophers who have repudiated the goal of truth. Nietzsche, for example, would argue that there are no truths, only interpretations. But you need only ask yourself whether what Nietzsche says is true to realize how paradoxical it is. If it is true, then it is false. In the sense of the so-called liar paradox. Does that remind you of John Paulus? Likewise, the French philosopher Michel Foucault repeatedly argues that the truth of an epoch has no authority outside the power structure of the universe. There is no transhistorical truth about the human condition. But again, we should ask yourself whether that last statement is true, for if it is false. There is arisen among modernist philosophers a certain paradoxism which is served to put them out of communication with those of their contemporaries who are merely modern. A writer who says that there are no truths or that all truth is merely relative is asking you not to believe him, so don't. She just got criticized. Okay, so speaking of paradoxes, we're also getting political and religious. Time to think about God as a cosmic dictator. One of my favorite things when we think about God as a cosmic dictator. My gosh, dude, my gosh. I mean, can you help being born in North Korea? Think about those citizens. Can you help being born in North Korea? No. Oh my God, no. There's a essential paradox of the core religion. The true great monotheisms teach people to think abjectly themselves as miserable and guilty sinners, prostrate before an angry and jealous God who, according to the script accounts, fashioned them out of dust and clay or cloud of blood. Their positions for prayer are usually emulations of the suppliant serf before an ill-tempered monarch. It is the wish to live as an abject slave. That dude got away with saying this to the black population. Good job, Hitch. The message is one of continual submission, gratitude, and fear. Life itself is a poor thing, an interval in which to prepare for the hereafter, or the coming or second coming of the Messiah. On the other hand, and as by way of compensation, religion teaches people to be extremely self-centered and conceited. It assures them that God cares for them individually, and it claims that the cosmos was created with them specifically in mind. This explains the supercilious expression on the face of those who practice religion simultaneously. Pray, excuse my modesty and humility, but I happen to be busy or there for God. The reason why Hitchens got away with it is because he's not a racist. Okay. So that ties into Missler, don't it? It shows that the cosmos squared with them specifically and mind. Okay, all right, read that. Okay. Cosmos was squared with them specifically and mind. So this says in Missler, right? It is absurd to say that the human race is the object and the end of creation. Man, charmed with his own merits, imagines that it is but his own kind that God proposed as the object and the end in the formation of the universe. Upon what is this so flattering opinion based? It is, we are told upon this, that man is the only being endowed with an intelligence which enables him to know the divine nature and to render to it homage worthy of it. We are assured that God created the world for his own glory, and that the human race was included in his plan in order that he might have somebody to admire and glorify him, his words. But by these intentions has not God visibly missed his end? 1, according to you, it would always be impossible for man to know his God, and he would be kept in the most invincible ignorance of the divine essence. 2, a being who has no equals cannot be susceptible of glory. Glory can result but from the comparison of his own excellence with that of others. 3, if God by himself is infinitely happy and is sufficient unto himself, why does he need the homage of his feeble creatures? 4, in spite of all of his works, God is not glorified. On the contrary, all the religions of the world show to us as perpetually offended. Their great object is to reconcile sinful, ungrateful, and rebellious man with his wrathful God. All right, we're also going to tie that into Bertrand Russell. I love this guy so much. And if you're a cool Christian, you felt Russell, right? That's right. Even if you disagree with him. Religion, since it has a source in terror, has dignified certain kinds of fear and made people think them not disgraceful. Wait, isn't it this fear? Okay, so in this, it has done mankind a great disservice. All fear is bad. Wait, what about Halloween? The foundation of Halloween. Fear. Don't disagree with Bertrand Russell. Merry Christmas. Not all fear is bad. What about awe? Without fear, there is no awe. We'll get more into that later. This is right with man's awe before the great infinity of death. We'll get it with that nation. All fear is bad. I disagree with that statement. Why? Because I love Halloween. That's why. I believe that when I die, I shall rot and nothing of my ego will survive. I'm not young and I love life, but I shall scorn the shiver with terror at the thought of annihilation. Happiness is not true happiness because it must come to an end. Nor do thought and love lose their value because they are not everlasting. Many a man has borne himself proudly in the scaffold. Surely the same pride should think truly about man's place in the world, even if the open windows of science at first make us shiver after the cozy indoor warmth of traditional humanizingness. In the end, the fresh air brings vigor, and the great places have a splendor of their own. The philosophy of nature is one thing, the philosophy of value is quite another, and nothing but harm can come be confused. And then what we think good, what we should like, has no bearing whatever upon what is, which is the question for the philosophy of nature. On the other hand, we cannot be forbidden to value this or that on the ground that a non-human world does not value it, nor can we be compelled to admire anything because it is a law of nature. Undoubtedly, we are part of nature, which is reduce our desires, our hopes, and fears in accordance with laws which a physicist is beginning to discover. In this sense, we are part of nature. In the philosophy of nature, we are subordinated to nature, the outcome of natural laws, and the victims in the long run. The philosophy of nature must not be unduly terrestrial. For the Earth is merely one of the smaller planets, one of the smallest cells in the Milky Way. It would be ridiculous for the philosophy of nature to bring up results so pleasing to the tiny parasites of this insignificant planet. There's a really good point here. Vitalism is a philosophy, and evolutionism show in this respect of lack of sense of proportion and logical relevance. They regard the facts of life which are personally interesting to us as having cosmic significance, not a significance confined to their surface. Optimism and pessimism as cosmic philosophy show the same that humanism. The great world, so far as we know from the philosophy of nature, is not a good nor bad. It's not considered to make us happy or unhappy. All such philosophies spring from self-importance and are best corrected by little astronomy. When a philosophy of value, the situation is reversed. Nature is only a part of what we can imagine. Everything real and imagined can be praised by us, and there's no outside standard to show that our valuation is wrong. We ourselves are ultimate and reputable arbiters of value, and in the world of value, nature is only a part. Thus, in this world, we are greater than nature. In the world of values, nature in itself is neutral, neither good nor bad, deserving and neither admiration nor censure. It is we who create value and deserves which confer value. In this realm, we are kings, and we base our kingship if we bow down to nature. It's for us to determine the good life, not for nature, not even for nature, personified as God. All right. So that was cool. That was cool there. All right, we're going to keep going. We're going to get political again. My own view on religion is that of Lucretius. I regard it as a disease born of fear and as a source of untold misery to the human race. I cannot, however, deny that it has made some contributions to civilization. It helped in early days to fix the calendar, and it caused Egyptian priests to chronicle eclipses with such care that in time they became able to predict them. These services I'm prepared to acknowledge, but I do not know of any others. The word religion is used nowadays in a very loose sense. Some people, under the influence of extreme Protestantism, employ the word to denote any serious personal convictions as to morals or the nature of the universe. This use of the word is quite unhistorical. Religion is primarily a social phenomenon. Churches may owe their origin to teachers with strong individual convictions, but these teachers have seldom had much influence upon the churches that they founded, whereas churches have had enormous influence upon the communities in which they flourished. They take the case that is of most interest to members of Western civilization, the teaching of Christ, as it appears in the Gospels, has had extraordinarily little to do with the ethics of Christians. The most important thing about Christianity from a social and historical point of view is not Christ, but the church. And if we are to judge of Christianity as a social force, we must not go to the Gospels for our material. Christ taught that you should give your goods to the poor, that you should not fight, that you should not go to church, and that you should not punish adultery. Neither Catholics nor Protestants have shown any strong desire to follow his teaching in any of these respects. Some of the Franciscans, it is true, attempted to teach a doctrine of apostolic poverty, but the Pope condemned them and the doctrine was declared heretical. Or again, consider such a text as judge not that ye be not judged, and ask yourself what influence such a text has had upon an Inquisition and a Ku Klux Klan. What is true of Christianity is equally true of Buddhism. The Buddha was amiable and enlightened. On his deathbed, he laughed at his disciples for supposing that he was immortal. But the Buddhist priesthood, as it exists, for example, in Tibet, has been obscurantist, terrorist, and cruel in the highest degree. There's nothing accidental about this difference between the church and its founder. As soon as absolute truth is supposed to be contained in the sayings of a certain man, there's a body of experts to interpret his sayings, and these experts infallibly acquire power since they hold the key to truth. Like any other privileged caste, they use their power for their own advantage. They are, however, in one respect worse than any other privileged caste, since it is their business to expound an unchanging truth, revealed once for all in other perfection, so that they become necessarily opponents of all intellectual and moral progress. The church opposed Galileo and Darwin. In our day, it opposes Freud. In the days of its greatest power, it went further in its opposition to the intellectual life. Pope Gregory the Great wrote to a certain bishop a letter beginning, "A report has reached us, which we cannot mention without a blush, that thou expoundest grammar to certain friends." The bishop was compelled by pontifical authority to desist from this wicked labor, and Latinity did not recover until the Renaissance. It is not only intellectually, but also morally that religion is pernicious. I mean by this that it teaches ethical codes which are not conducive to human happiness. When a few years ago a plebiscite was taken in Germany as to whether the deposed royal houses should still be allowed to enjoy their private property, the churches in Germany officially stated that it would be contrary to the teaching of Christianity to deprive them of it. The churches, as everyone knows, opposed the abolition of slavery as long as they dared. With a few well-advertised exceptions, they opposed at the present day every movement toward economic justice. The Pope was officially condemned socialism. All right, now we're going to lean into the race matters. Even though I'm a white boy, I have no idea what it's like to be black. White boy, I have no idea what it's like to be black. Let's get into it. A little more than a century after Joseph Smith fell victim to the violence of many that had helped to unleash another prophetic voice was raised in the United States. A young black pastor named Dr. Martin Luther King began to preach to his people the descendants of their slavery that Joseph Smith and all other Christian churches had so warmly approved should be free. It is quite impossible even for an atheist like myself to read his sermons or watch recordings of his speeches without profound emotion of the sort that can sometimes bring genuine tears. Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail written in response to a group of white Christian clerics had urged him to serve restraint to patience. In other words, his place as a model of Parliament. Icy, polite, and generous minded, is so breathes with an unquenchable conviction that the filthy injustice of racism must be borne no longer. We hold our views with as much conviction and principle as any godfather does. So, no God, no racism. That's my view. No racism, even though I have no idea what it's like to be black. Reminding yourself that day in, day out, if you're a white boy. Atheism, right? The proper starting point for the crucial debate about the prospects for Black America is an examination of the nihilism that increasingly pervades Black communities. Nihilism is to be understood here not as a philosophical doctrine that there are no rational grounds for legitimate standards or authority. It is far more the lived experience of coping with a life of horrifying meaninglessness, hopelessness, and most important, lovelessness. The frightening result is a numbing detachment from others and a self-destructive disposition toward the world. Life without meaning, hope, and love breeds a cold-hearted, mean-spirited outlet that destroys both the individual and others. Nihilism is not new in Black America. The first African encounter with the New World was an encounter with a distinctive form of the absurd. The initial Black struggle against degradation and devaluation and enslaved circumstances of the New World wasn't part of struggle against nihilism. In fact, the major enemy of Black survival in America has been and is neither oppression nor exploitation, but rather the nihilistic threat. That is, loss of hope and absence of meaning. For as long as hope remains and meaning is preserved, the possibility of overcoming oppression stays alive. The self-fulfilling prophecy of the nihilistic threat is that without hope, there could be no future. And without meaning, there could be no struggle. The genius of our Black foremothers and forefathers was to create powerful buffers to ward off the nihilistic threat, to equip Black folk with cultural armor to beat back the demons of hopelessness, meaninglessness, and lovelessness. These buffers consisted of cultural structures of meaning and feeling that created and sustained communities. This armor constituted ways of life and struggle that embodied values of service and sacrifice, love and care, discipline and excellence. In other words, traditions for Black surviving and thriving under usually adverse New World conditions were major barriers against the nihilistic threat. These traditions consist primarily of Black religious and civic institutions that sustain familial and communal networks of support. If cultures are in part what human beings create out of antecedent fragments of other cultures, in order to convince themselves not to commit suicide, then Black foremothers and forefathers ought to be applauded. In fact, until the early 70s, Black Americans had the lowest suicide rate in the United States. But now young Black people lead the nation in the rate of increase in suicides. What has changed? What went wrong? The bitter irony of integration? The cumulative effects of a genocidal conspiracy? Virtual collapse of rising expectations after the optimistic 60s? None of us fully understands why the cultural structures that once sustained Black life in America are no longer able to fend off a nihilistic threat. I believe that two significant reasons why the threat is more powerful now than ever before are the saturation of market forces and market moralities in Black life, and the present crisis in Black leadership. The recent market-driven shattering of Black civil society, Black families, neighborhoods, schools, churches, mosques, leaves more and more Black people vulnerable to daily lives endured with little sense of self and fragile existential moorings. Black people have always been in America's wilderness in search of a promised land. Yet many Black folk now reside in a jungle ruled by a cutthroat market morality devoid of any faith in deliverance or hope for freedom. Contrary to the superficial claims of conservative behaviorists, these jungles are not primarily the result of pathological behavior. Rather, this behavior is the tragic response of a people bereft of resources and confronting the workings of U.S. capitalist society. Saying this is not the same as asserting that individual Black people are not responsible for their actions. Black murderers and rapists should go to jail. But it must be recognized that the nihilistic threat contributes to criminal behavior. It is a threat that feeds on poverty and shattered cultural institutions and grows more powerful as the armors toward against it are weakened. All right. That was Mr. Cornel West. I love Cornel West. Incredible. Now we're going to get into this little book here by William Hubban. Get more of a little philosophy here, talking about meaning, right? There remains a last question to consider: what is the meaning of death? Nietzsche's thinking reveals this dual and contradictory character at this point with tragic finality. He chooses the transcendence of man beyond himself and the Superman, and even the transcendence of Christianity and something super Christian. The Christian belief in life after death, has reduced life value on Earth. Man is but his hope in the future, instead of perfecting himself here and now. Death is final, and nothing follows it. He does away with all man's all before the great infinity of death. The strong man will want to live in such a way that he has also the will to die at the right moment. Only life matters, it is absolute, whereas death is irrelevant. Christianity has made of death nothing but a gruesome comedy, a perversion of all values. In the Christian hereafter, in the Christian hereafter, the healthy and strong ones are punished, while inhibited slavish ones receive the ample fulfillment of bliss because they have repressed their best natural impulses in life. They have lived in fear of life, anxious to attain heaven. But the strong men never feared life, even when it left them. Like an unfaithful woman, the fear of death is a European disease, identical with the fear of hell. The weak is the will to live fully in exaltation. Even death, then, must not be permitted to have its own way. The truly creative man wants to die when his ever-rising vision ceases to grow. The sick patient is a parasite for whom it is indecent to go on living, and he ought to free others from his sad plight. Though much too many are to be told that they are burdened to others. The creative Superman will know it when to die voluntarily. Suicide, therefore, becomes a sacramental and unselfish act. Oh my gosh. These answers to the meaning of life and death reveal that Nietzsche is a nihilist. His own definition of this type of thinker is wholly acceptable. He says, a nihilist is one who judges of the world as it exists, that it should not be, whereas he says of the world as it ought to be, that it does not exist. But such clever juggling applies equally to the idealist who is disappointed by existing imperfections. It is probably more accurate to call a man a nihilist who considers life meaningless, without moral law, devoid of vows common to all men, and without the prospect of a hereafter. Such too was Archimedes' boastful nihilism and recognized fathers and sons, recognizing only as a law that there must be no law. Nietzsche rejects this nihilism as decadent and is part of Europe's declining mentality. He considered his mission to transform all existing values, create new ones, and leave beyond the present good and evil. Yet his prophetic and politically striking thoughts have remained negative, actless, and without a concrete goal. The most sympathetic student of Nietzsche was since only a superhuman attempt to rise above the realities of time and tradition in the world as Nietzsche saw it, a vain Daedalus flight towards the sun. Irrespective of the truth of many of his criticisms, the tragedy of his own life, and the even more disastrous consequences of his philosophy for German and European history have assigned him the role of a great destroyer. Ooh, okay. Now, on to Onfray. This is Hitchens' philosophical baggage on Goodreads. Someone said they don't like him. But if you don't like Nietzsche, this is what it says on Goodreads. If you don't like Nietzsche, you're not going to like Onfray. So I read that. It's also the guy who criticized the Dino. The militant atheist. Does not like Hitchens. I do, though. How much you want to bet that dude likes Richard Dawkins or something? Incest offender. I don't want to assume though, but I do like Hitchens, and he did make a point, better points than I made in this video. But we're going to get into Onfray. It is absurd to think that being Nietzschean means being the same as Nietzsche. It is not until subscribing to his major themes, resentment, eternal return, the Superman, would a power, physiology of art, or any other aspect of his philosophical system. No need. What good would it do to take oneself or Nietzsche on his mantle, adopt those ideas wholesale, and assume his thinking? That is not Nietzschean. In only small minds can think it was. Being Nietzschean requires the one to think apart from him, starting from the spot where the work in progress and his philosophy was transformed by his passage. He called for unfaithful disciples who by their betrayal would prove their loyalty. He wanted people to obey him by following themselves and no one else, not even him, particularly not him. And thus spake Zarathustra, the parable of the three metamorphoses, tells us how the spirit becomes first a camel, then a lion, and finally a child. This and other of his works teach the dialectic and theory of aesthetics that we can put to practical use. So we must honor Nietzsche if we go past him. Certainly, we remember his work, but above all, we lean out the way one leans one's weight on a huge lever in order to move philosophical mountains. Nietzsche launched a new building project that represents an advance for atheism. Missler denied all divinity, Holbach dismantled Christianity, Feuerbach deconstructed God. Feuerbach, okay, so we're talking about response. Feuerbach. Mr. Douglas. In Mr. Douglas's library, got a bust of Feuerbach and David Strauss and Frederick Douglass's library. And I'm pretty sure that Mr. Douglas admires Feuerbach as a philosopher. I think. I don't know for sure. So, since we're talking about race finance, I think that's important to note. Mr. Douglas's library, Feuerbach. No, I would say Feuerbach is pretty much the best atheist God, in my opinion. I mean, him and Bertrand Russell and Christopher Hitchens and Friedrich Nietzsche are pretty much the best that atheists are going to get. I have preferences of atheists. Feuerbach deconstructed God. Then Nietzsche introduced Hume's valuation. Atheism is not in itself do away with God, yes, but then what? Another morality and new ethic values never before thought of because unthinkable. This innovation is what makes it possible to arrive at atheism and to surpass it. A formidable task once still to be brought to fruition. The Antichrist narrates European nihilism, which is still with us, and proposes a pharmacopoeia for that metaphysical and ontological disease for civilization. Nietzsche's solutions are known to us and register more than a century of life and misunderstandings. Being Nietzschean means proposing alternative hypotheses. Fresh, new, post-Nietzschean, but assimilating a show on the mountain peaks. Various forms of contemporary nihilism call more than ever for transvaluation to find leaves behind it the religious and secular hypotheses born of the monotheism. Zarathustra must return to the conflict. Atheism alone makes an exit from nihilism possible. Alrighty. An exit from Nietzsche possible, I guess. I would say the final boss of atheism. You want to know the final boss of atheism? Mr. Douglas's library. If we can get past Mr. Douglas's library. Can you get past Mr. Douglas's library? I don't think I can, man. I'm too white. I can't get past it. I can't get past Mr. Douglas's library. Oh no. I don't even know. Shabbat was incredible, wasn't he? Alright, so what's after that? Oh yeah, that's right. Levinas and Asian thought. Levinas and Asian thought. Beyond the specific questionability of Greek philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, and despite Socrates' testimony and the apology that human wisdom is worth little or nothing in contrast with the divine wisdom that no mortals possess, there is a sense in which all wisdom is betrayal. Wisdom, even the most compassionate pacifist, can be complicit with injustice and violence and excuse suffering. Yet, even as wisdom and communication can betray individuals and humanity, they potentially interrupt such complicity by indicating something other than betrayal in the midst of its power. The realities of moral exploitation and possibility of the moral purity and fidelity of the virtuous and the wise are not the conclusion but the point of departure for ethics, according to Levinas in his preface 2. Totality and infinity. After the moralism of the righteous self which abandons others to the imperfections of the world, there remains the possibility of awakening to the other, an ethical encounter. This ethical event, prior to the universal ethical reflection of the moralist and the prudential judgment of the virtuous, is the betrayal and complicity of the self who is implicated, and thus must answer to the other in some way. This contribution is an investigation of the intersections and tensions between morality and complicity, or ethics and causality, in Levinas and Buddhism, with the aim of interrogating the possibility of a phenomenology of the ethical that neither brackets imminent worldly causal condition nor forgets it by transcending or excusing it. The transcendent ethical moment that interrupts the relentless economy of the real is not simply a negation of immanence and utopia, idealism, or otherworldliness critiqued by thinkers of radical immanence or physics nature that goes the laws. Ethical interpolation occurs and is significant only in the context of the unethical, the earthly suffering that afflicts the body, sensibility, and hunger and thirst, violence and war, birth, sickness, aging, and death. The ethical address happening within the midst of, and an antagonism with, the violence of beings imminent to both the difficult task respond to the other in self-transformation. This is edited by Kyle Manson, Frank Garrett, and Sarah Matisse. Pretty good book, I love it. Picked that up at a bookstore at South Carolina. Alright. Now we're going to get into this part in The Power of Myth. Joseph Campbell. I gotta thank my dad for introducing me into this one. Like all heroes, the Buddha doesn't share the truth itself. He shows you the way to truth. But it's got to be your way, not his. The Buddha can't tell you exactly how to get rid of your particular fears, for example. Different teachers may suggest exercises, but they may not be the ones to work for you. All a teacher can do is suggest. He's like a lighthouse that says, there are rocks over here, steer clear. There's eternal water out there. The big problem of any young person's life is that models to suggest possibilities. Nietzsche says, man is the sick animal. Man is the animal that doesn't know what to do with itself. The mind has many possibilities, but we can live no more than one life. What are we going to do with ourselves? A living myth presents contemporary models. Alrighty. Go to Nietzsche. We're going to get into Ecce Homo. To be free of resentment, to be aware of resentment, who knows how much I'll ultimately have to thank my long illness for, even for that. The problem is not an easy one. You have to have experienced it from strength as well as from weakness. If anything has to be upheld against illness, against weakness, it is that man's actual sense of salvation. That is to say, his instinct for war and taking up arms has been worn out. We know how to break free from nothingness. We enter the coat with nothingness. We want to push nothingness away from us. It all hurts. Many things crowd in. All experiences strike too deep. Memory is a festering wound. Illness itself is a form of resentment. In the face of that, the sick man has only one great remedy. I call it Russian fatalism. That fatalism without revolt, with which a Russian soldier lies down in the snow at the end of a campaign that was all too hard, to accept nothing further, to take nothing on, nothing in, to cease reacting altogether. The great sense in such fatalism, that is not always merely courage to die, for it can be life-saving under deadly circumstances, lies in reducing the metabolism. Slowing it down as a form of will to hibernate. If we take this reasoning a few steps further, we arrive at the fact that we sleep for weeks in a tomb, because we wear ourselves out much too quickly. if we react in any way, we don't react at all. That is the principle. And nothing wears us up faster than the emotion of resentment. Anger, morbid sensitivity, the inability to force revenge, the yearning, the thirst for revenge, the concoction of all types of poison. This surely is for the exhausted the most detrimental way to react. It involves a rapid consumption of nervous energy, a pathological increase of harmful secretions, for instance, that abide to the stomach. Resentment is all that's forbidden to the sick man. It is his worst evil. Unfortunately, it is also what he most desires. That was recognized by the profound physician Buddha. His religion, which should rather be called a hygiene system to avoid any confusion with such a wretched thing as Christianity, works because it depends on the conquest of resentment. If we're to solve it, this is the first step towards recovery. Animosity is not ended by animosity. Animosity is ended by friendship. Thus begins Buddha's doctrine. This is not the voice of morality, but of physiology. Resentment born of weakness is harmful to no one more than to the weak man himself. Conversely, with a fundamentally rich nature, it is a superfluous emotion, which if kept under control is almost a proof of riches. Those riches who know how seriously my philosophy is taken up the fight against the feelings of revenge and rancor, even taking on the doctrine of free will, the fight against Christianity is a really small part of it, will understand why I emphasize my own personal attitude, my zinc of confidence and radicality at precisely this point. During my decadent period, I denied myself these feelings as being harmful. As soon as life offered once again wealth and pride, I denied them myself as being beneath me. That Russian fatalism of which I spoke manifested itself in such a way that for years I clung tenaciously to almost unbearable conditions, locations, dwellings, societies. Once fate had sent them my way, it was better than changing them, better than feeling they could be changed, better than rebelling against them. Anyone who interfered with my fatalism, tried forcibly to awaken me, would have been my mortal enemy in those days. In truth, it would have been fatally dangerous every time. Thinking of yourself as a destiny, not want to be other than you are, that is under such circumstances the highest wisdom. Now, war is a different matter altogether. I'm essentially a warrior. To wage war is one of my instincts. Talent for animosity to actually be an enemy. Enmity. This perhaps presupposes a strong nature. In any case, it is a precondition of every strong nature. Okay, what do you guys say? Those who think they know God's will can tell you what it is. For our enemies and your enemies too. I don't know if I have another contact there, but I'm going to put it in there. In these resistances, therefore, it seeks out resistance. Aggressive pathos is just as necessary for strength as resentment and rancor for weakness. Women. Wait a second. Women, for instance, are vengeful, that is due to their weakness as much as to the sensitivity to others' distress. There is no male and female. Or female. Don't be a Luna simp, right? A Jesus simp, right? Jesus is Luna, right? The strength of the aggressor, in a way, has its measure in the opposition he requires. Any uncreation strength makes itself known when seeking out a mighty opponent, or indeed, problem. For a philosopher who is a warrior will also do battle with problems. The task is not to overcome opponents at all costs, but only those against whom you must put all your strength, subtlety, and fighting skill. Opponents who are equals, equality before the enemy, that is the main condition to fight a fair duel. Wow, that reminds me of equality for the enemy. Alright, okay. Where you have contempt, you cannot wage war. Where you're in commands, where you can see someone beneath you, you should not wage war. Always looking down on things and people. Okay, so... Okay, that's not bad then. My war tactics can be summed up in 4 theorems. Firstly, I only ever engage with causes that are winnable. If necessary, I wait until they win. Secondly, I only ever engage with causes where we find no allies, where I stand alone, where I compromise only myself. I've never publicly taken a single step which has not compromised me. That is my criterion for doing right. Thirdly, I never attack people. I use a person merely as a powerful magnifying glass that allows me to make visible a general but insidious and elusive calamity. In this way, I attacked David Strauss, and to put it more plainly, the success of a senile book amongst the culture classes of Germany, thereby catching his culture red-handed. In this way, I attacked Wagner, or to put it more plainly, the hypocrisy, the semi-refined instinct of our culture, which confuses the artful richness, the late with the great. Fourthly, I only ever attack things for which all personal differences are excluded, where any background or bad experience is lacking. On the contrary, to attack is to me a proof of goodwill, in some circumstances even of gratitude. It is an honor, a reward if I associate my name with a matter or person, notwithstanding whether I'm for it or against it. If I wage war on Christianity, I have a right to do so because it's not going to stop, and because if I wage war on Christianity, I have a right to do so because it's not going to kill me, and they're not going to stop me. The most serious Christians were always favorably disposed towards me. I myself the strictest opponent of Christianity, and far from minding to bear grudges against individuals, for it has been an undoing of centuries. I really like that one. There. It's really smart. So that's the enmity without the enmity, right? Enmity without the enmity. Okay. What's after that? Okay, so we're talking about the anger, right? The outrage. We're gonna get back into the hit slot. we're going to start getting a little political here. Again, we're talking about totalitarianism. I'm still deciding for myself if this dude was really the totalitarian expert or not. Because, I mean, look at this guy. I think he might be a totalitarian genius. Totalitarian genius. When I left North Korea, which I did with a sense of mingled relief, outrage, and pity so strong that I can still summon it, I was leaving a totalitarian state and also a religious one. I've since talked with many of the brave people who are trying to undermine this atrocious system from within and without. Let me admit at once that some of the bravest of these resistors are fundamentalist Christian anti-communists. One of these courageous men gave an interview not long ago in which he was honest enough to say that he had a difficult time preaching the idea of a savior to the half-starved and terrified few who had managed to escape their prison state. The whole idea of an infallible and all-powerful redeemer, they said, struck them as a bit too familiar. A bowl of rice and some exposure to some wider culture and a relief from the hideous dim of compulsory enthusiasm will be the most they could ask for now. Those who are fortunate enough to get as far as South Korea or the United States may find themselves confronted with the end of the Messiah, the jailbird and tax evader Seung Myung-moon, undisputed head of the Unification Church, a major contributor to the extreme right in the United States, is one of the patrons of the intelligent Zion racket. A leading figure of the so-called movement, and a man who never fails to award his God-man guru his proper name of father, is Jonathan Wells, the author of a laughable anti-evolutionist diatribe entitled The Icons of Evolution. As well as himself touchingly put it, Father's words, my studies, my prayers convinced me that I should devote my life to destroying Darwinism, just as many of my fellow Unifactionists had already devoted their lives to destroying Marxism. When Father chose me, along with about a dozen of other seminary graduates, to enter a PhD program in 1978, I welcomed the opportunity to do battle. Mr. Wells's book isn't unlikely even to rate a footnote in the history of Pythol, but having seen fatherhood at work in both of the two careers, I have an idea of what the burned-over district of upstate New York must have looked and felt like when the believers had everything their own way. Religion, even in its meekest, has to admit that what it is proposing is a total solution, which faith must be to some extent blind, in which all aspects of the private and public life must be submitted to permanent higher supervision. This constant surveillance and continual subjection, usually reinforced by fear in the shape of infinite vengeance, does not invariably bring out the best mammalian characteristics. It is certainly true that emancipation from religion does not always produce the best mammal either. Definitely case in point. Always produce the best mammal either. If anyone would like to acquire humility, I cannot think tell them the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud. And the biggest step, too. At least nothing whatever can be done before it. If you think you're not conceited, it means you are very conceited indeed. There's good nature in there, too. It's self-deception part of philosophers and moralists to imagine them a big one decadence, and they're with decadence themselves, right? Okay, so what about that subjection here? In order to be part of the totalitarian mindset, it is not necessary to wear a uniform or carry a club or a whip. It is only necessary to wish for your own subjection and the subjection of others. What is a totalitarian system if not one of the abject glorification of the perfect leader is matched by the surrender of all privacy and individuality, especially matters sexual, and then enunciation and punishment for the own good of those who transgress. The sexual element is probably decisive, and that the dull spine being grasped with Nathaniel Hawthorne captioned the Scarlet Letter, the deep connection between oppression and perversion. Okay. Let's see here. So, God's in everything, right? Okay, so Jesus is God, right? I'm going to have a really crazy thought. All right. Get ready for this. So, it's unnecessary. Okay. The necessary realization that Jesus both wished and needed to die came to Jerusalem at Passover known to do so. And then also part in his murder unknowingly doing God's will and fulfilling ancient prophecies at breakneck speed against himself. There are many of the range prophets who are impossible at the time of this one who believe themselves at least some of the time to be God. Or the son of God, and that has been all the difference. At breakneck speed against himself, right? That's one for you coming in there. Okay. This is where it's going to get crazy. It is clear the fundamental doctrines of Christianity made a great deal of ethical perversion before they could be accepted. The world we are told was created by God is both good and omnipotent. Before he created the world, he foresaw the pain and misery that it would contain. He is therefore responsible for all of it. It is useless to argue that the pain in the world is due to sin in the first place. This is not true. It's not sin that causes the river server for the big civil kid disrupted. Even if it were true, it would make no difference. If I were going to begin a China, then the child was going to be a homicidal maniac. I should be responsible for his crimes. If God in advance the sins of which men be guilty, he was clearly responsible for all the consequences of their sins when he decided to create man, when he decided to become man, and have himself subjected to torture on the cross. The usual Christian argument is that the suffering in the world is a purification for sin, and is therefore a good thing. God had to suffer with us. He couldn't help it. This argument is, of course, only a rationalization of Satanism, but in any case, is a very poor argument. I would invite any Christian to come into the children's wonderful hospital, watch the suffering that is there being endured, and And in a persistent assertion, those children are so morally abandoned that they deserve their suffering because God cannot help the other. Because God has spiritual strength, but no physical strength. In order to bring himself to say this, a man must assure himself all feelings of mercy and compassion. He must ensure make himself as cruel as the God in whom he believes. No man who believes us for the best in the suffering world keeps his ethical values unimpaired, since he's always trying to find excuses for pain and misery. I would invite any Christian to come to the cross, to watch the suffering that is everybody endured, and the persistent assertion that man is for more man that he is suffering because God cannot help himself. Because God cannot help himself, because God cannot help humanity, because God could not help humanity. That's the whole reason he became man, to help humanity. But he had to die first. Really? He could have just not suffered like that, and not had humanity suffer like that, right? But he chose to have us, he chose to die on the cross. He knew already what the final destination was, wishing for our own subjection. What do y'all think of that argument? I think it's pretty interesting if you think about God's omnipotence in a certain way. All right, back to Paulus. Interestingly, there is a classic irreligious argument against the existence of a certain sort of God that doesn't depend on logic and meaning of words alone. If one assumes that God is both omnipotent and omniscient, an obvious contradiction arises. Being omniscient, God knows everything that will happen. He can predict the future trajectory of every snowflake, the surrounding of every blade of grass, and the deeds of every human being, as well as all of his own actions. Being omnipotent, he can act in any way and do anything he wants, including behaving in ways different from those he's predicted, making his expectations uncertain and fallible. He thus can't be both omnipotent and omniscient. So, suicide warning. We're about to get heavy on suicide with David Ramsey Steele here. God's suicide or abdication. Inventing bots to battle forever, humans have become almost omnipotent, but there's a lot they don't know, and as a result, they're threatened with annihilation by comparatively puny though crafty beings. So it seems that an omnipotent being with limited knowledge would be vulnerable, but that's because we suppose he can't foresee the effects of what he does. Yet, if he truly were omnipotent, the concept of effects wouldn't apply because nothing would follow from his actions except what he wanted to happen. Another reason for thinking that a literally omnipotent God must be omniscient is that it would be part of omnipotence to become omniscient just by willing it. And why would he not have done this long ago? A substantially omnipotent God who commits blunders and has to face unintended consequences seems unacceptable. However, just this kind of God is clearly depicted in the Torah. Seeing how humans have turned out, God regrets having created them, Genesis 6:6. The Torah repeatedly tells us that God did not foresee what would happen and changed his mind about what to do. There's always been a current within Judaism willing to accept God's limited knowledge and limited wisdom. The Jewish theologian Canon Moss depicts a very personal, very powerful God who miscalculates and learns by experience. Ellender Schwartzwitz has contended that the distinctive merit of the Torah is that none of its characters, including God, is entirely worthy of emulation. If God can limit himself, he can injure himself. With God, the two concepts are hard to distinguish, and if he can injure himself, perhaps he can commit suicide. A case for the suicide of God was made by Scott Adams of the word fame, and is amusing work God's theory, which Adams calls fiction, but which libraries insist on classifying as cosmology. Humans are evolving so as to reconstitute God's fragmented being. In the Kabbalistic tradition of Judaism, Isaac ben Solomon Luria advanced the theory that God had created the world by limiting himself while withdrawing from a certain area of existence. More recently, Hans Jonas has maintained in the creating universe, God committed suicide, though he will eventually be reconsidered out of the end of the universe. Okay, now it's going to get super intense. We're going to have the racist scum step in. But his philosophy is distinct from his racism, right? As long as we keep acknowledging it every time we open a book. He was a racist. We have to keep reminding ourselves that, right? It would be easy to prove that suicide is as lawful from Christian dispensations as was to the heathen. So there's not a single text of scripture which prohibits it. That great and infallible rule of faith and practice, which must control all philosophy and human reasoning, has left us in its particular to our natural liberty. Resignation and providence is indeed recommended in Scripture, but that implies only submission to ills that are unavoidable, not to such as may be remedied by prudence or courage. Thou shalt not kill is a commitment to exclude the killing of others over whose life we have no authority. That this precept, like most of the Scripture precepts, must be modified by reason and common sense is plain for the practice of magistrates who punish criminals capitally, notwithstanding that of the law. But where this commandment ever so expressed against suicide, when I have no authority, for all the law of Moses is abolished, except so far as is established by the law of nature, we have already endeavored to prove that suicide is not prohibited by that law. In all cases, Christians and heathens are precisely upon the same footing, Cato and Brutus. Era and Portia acted heroically. Those who not imitate their example ought to receive the same praises from posterity. The power of committing suicide is brought about planning as an advantage which men possess even above the deity himself. God cannot, even if he wishes to commit suicide, the supreme boon that is found among all of the penalties of life. Okay, Mr. Willis is about to step in. Wait, God can't commit suicide? Really? It's false. But supposing God became a man? Suppose our human nature, which can suffer and die, was amalgamated with God's nature in one person. Then that person can help us. Then God could commit suicide. He could surrender his will and suffer and die because he was man, and he could do it perfectly because he was God. You and I can go through this process only if God does it in us. But God can do it only if it becomes man. Our attempts at this dying will succeed only if we men share in God's dying. God's suicide. Just as our thinking can succeed only because it's a drop out of the ocean of his intelligence. But we cannot share God's dying unless God dies. And it cannot die except by being a man. That is the sense in which he pays our debt and suffers for us what he himself need not suffer at all. Once again, guys, do not commit suicide. This is just purely for philosophical reasons. Give up yourself, and you will find your real self. Lose your life, and you will save it. Submit to death. Death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. We look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him everything else thrown in the end. Wow. That's quite someone. God, suicide. Well, that just kind of knocks your butt off. Alright. To me, that's a pretty good atheist argument, too. God's suicide. Wow. Okay. So, since we're on the topic of suicide, time for Abacamu, right? Sisyphus. In a sense, and as in melodrama, killing yourself amounts to confessing. It is confessing that life is too much for you, or that you do not understand it. Let's not go too far in such analogies, however, but rather return to everyday words. It is merely confessing that is not worth the trouble. Take no thought for tomorrow. Living naturally is never easy. You continue making the gestures commanded by existence for many reasons, the first of which is habit. Dying voluntarily implies that you recognize, even instinctively, the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of that daily agitation, and the uselessness of suffering. Alright, back to races. It's gone. That suicide may often be consistent with interest and with our duty to our souls, no one can question. Who allows that age, sickness, and misfortune may render life a burthen and make it worse even than annihilation. I believe that no man ever threw away life while it was worth keeping, for such was the natural horror of death, that small motives will never be able to reconcile us to it, and that perhaps the situation of a man's health and fortune did not seem to require this remedy. We may at least be assured that anyone who, without apparent reason, has had recourse to it, was cursed with such incurable depravity or gloominess of temper as must poison all enjoyment, and render him equally miserable as if he had been loaded with the most grievous misfortunes. If suicide be supposed a crime, 'tis only cowardice can impel us to it. If it be no crime, both prudence and courage, and engages to rid ourselves at once of existence when it becomes a burden. 'Tis the only way that we can then be useful to society, by setting an example, which if imitated would preserve that everyone has chance for happiness in life, and would effectively free him from all danger or misery. Okay, so now into the teachings of the Buddha. Teachings of the Buddha, we're going for sickness, old age, and death. Did you never see in the world a man or a woman 80, 90, or 100 years old, frail, crooked as a gable roof, bent down, resting on crutches, with tottering steps, infirm youths, long since fled, with broken teeth, grand, scanty hair, and none wrinkled with blotched limbs? And then a thought never come to you that you also subject to decay, that you also cannot escape it. Did you never see in the world a man or a woman who, being sick, afflicted, and grievously ill, wallowing in his own filth, was lifted up by some and put to bed by others? And then the thought never come to you that you also subject to the disease, that you also cannot escape it. Did you never see in the world the corpse of a man or a woman 1 or 2 or 3 days after death, 1 or 2 or 3 days after death, swollen up, blue, black, and golden, full of corruption? And did the thought never come to you that you also subject to death, that you also cannot escape it? Suppose a man who was not blind beheld the many bubbles of the Ganges as they drove along, and he watched them and carefully examined them. Then, after he had carefully examined them, they would appear to him empty, unreal, and unsubstantial. In exactly the same way does the monk behold all physical phenomena, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and states of consciousness, whether they be of the past or the present or the future, far or near, And he observes them and examines them carefully, and after carefully examining them, they appear to him empty, void, and without a self. That's cool. Is one of my favorite spiritual thinkers called Jaspers, edited by Hannah Arendt. Cool secularist mentioned in Hutchins' book. What is the who? What is the self? Who am I? Buddha's answers are astonishing. He denies the self. The doctrine is formulated as follows. There is no self. Existence is made up of factors which form links in a chain of causality. Name of the five senses and their objects, variety, sensation, perceptions. It includes the unconscious formative power sense which are at work in the predispositions, drives, instincts, the constructive powers of vitality, and finally consciousness. These factors disintegrate in death. Their unity and center is not the self, but karma, which in rebirth creates another transient combination. But this formulation veils a meaning which is expressed with the same concepts more clearly than the context, where Buddha does not deny the self, but shows that no thought can penetrate to the true self. The body is not the self, sensations are not the self, ideas, forms, the unconscious powers of formation are not the self, cognition, pure intellectual consciousness is not the self. There is no one invariable self. What is subject to change is not mine, is not I, is not myself. But here, what is not the self is measured against the standard of a true self. The question of such a self remains open, but a hand is given in the direction in which is to be sought. They're not explicitly conceived as such, at most coincide with nirvana. In lessons derived from the stage of meditation, 3 stages of self are expounded. The first, the self is this body. The second, the self is the spiritual body, which in meditation drawn from this body is a blade of grass from the stalk. This self belongs to the realm of supersensory forms. Third, the unformed self consisting of consciousness, which belongs to the infinite realm of the ether. Each self clearly pertains to the stage of meditation, having validity for this stage, but no existence of its own. There is no true self. In sensory existence, the body is a self. In the first stage of meditation, the spiritual self of the ethereal body becomes real. The former self vanishes into nothingness. But in higher stages, the spiritual self is the self of all. Thus, even meditation itself is not blind, but it's shown to be relative. The true self is attainable at the highest stage, which coincides with nirvana. But if the doctrine cannot or simply does not say what the self is, the question arises: who benefits from redemption? Who is saved? No I, no self, no individual. What then is the stream of becoming, which is never being? All right, back again. Well, stream of becoming, which is never being. The affirmative answer to death and destruction, which is a decisive feature of a Dionysian philosophy, saying yes to opposition of war, of becoming along with the radical rejection, even of the concept of being. All this is definitively more closely related to me than anything else thought to date. The doctrine of the eternal recurrence, as I say, of the unconditional infinite circuit of all things, this doctrine of Zarathustra could already have been taught by Heraclitus. Stoicism, having inherited almost all the fundamental ideas of Heraclitus, so there's traces of it. Stream of becoming, which is never being. The illusion of a self, which is in truth no self. What is once illusion and ignorance and memory. Becoming is the chain of momentary existences, as more fully elaborated by later Buddhism. It is the mere momentariness of the non-being of everything that seems to be. There is no permanence, nothing that remains identical. Nowhere is there a fixed point. The self is the illusion of a transcendent, never-changing something, which regards itself as self. The stream of becoming and the illusion of selfhood have no foundation in anything else, but both can and should be transcended into something totally different, in the presence of which all forms of thought situated within the illusion of becoming and selfhood are without validity. Here there is neither being nor non-being. This state is revealed to enlightened insight and is attained in nirvana. Get ready. So, back to teaching Buddha. Between birth and death. Those who refer to the sorrow which arises from the round of birth and death seek for nirvana. They do not realize that between birth and death and nirvana, there's really no difference at all. They see nirvana as the absence of all becoming, and the cessation of all contact of sense organ and sense object, and they will not understand that it is really only the inner realization of the sort of impressions. Hence, they teach that there truly exists but the mind, which are no images. Therefore, they do not know the extent of what has been perceived by the minds of past, present, and future Buddhas, and continue in a conviction that the world extends beyond the range of the mind's eye. And so they keep on rolling on the will in birth and death. Birth and death are nirvana. Just understand that birth and death itself is nirvana, and you will neither hate one as being birth and death, nor cherish the other as being nirvana. Only then can it be free of birth and death. This present birth and death is the life of Buddha. If you reject it with distaste, or thereby losing the life of Buddha. If you abide in it and touch birth and death, you also lose the life of Buddha. But do not try to gauge it with your mind or speak it with words. When you simply release and forget both your body and your mind and throw yourself into the house of Buddha, then with no strength needed and no thought expended, free from birth and death, you become Buddha. Then there could be no obstacle in any person's mind. There's an extremely easy way to become Buddha, refraining from all evil, not clinging to birth and death, working for deep compassion for all sentient beings, respecting those over you, and having pity for those below you. Without any of the testing or desiring or lamentation, this is what is called Buddha. Do not search beyond it. All right. That's called Jaspers. There was a thing Scornfield. Yeah. Yes, control organ. Enlightenment is a clear-sighted vision attained at the highest stage of meditation. But enlightenment is also insight which, in the normal state of consciousness, transforms a whole representation of being in the self. This insight sees the world of samsara, it sees all the spheres of the world and all the paths of rebirth, from the elements of the spheres of the gods and the domains of hell. It sees the cause and the course of suffering, and indeed everything which the doctrine communicates inadequately in rational propositions. Nirvana, this insight can attain to nirvana, the ultimate redemption and goal of redemption. How can Buddha speak of nirvana? When he speaks, he must, after all, be speaking in the realm of illusory consciousness. When he speaks of nirvana, it turns into being or nothing. Thus, his speaking must assume a special character. It must speak of what to our object-pound opinion is nothing in it, and so doing so is all important. What is that? As we've seen, the illusion of becoming another self has no ground outside it. There's no escaping to a ground into another world, but becoming in itself can be wholly transcended to a realm where illusion ceases, and with it the thinking that we practice in our existence. We must bear in mind these paradoxes that defy logical understanding if we wish to get at the meaning of what Buddha says about nirvana. A few examples. There exists that condition where it is neither earth, nor water, nor fire, nor air, where there is neither sphere of infinite space, nor infinite consciousness, nor of nothingness, nor not of consciousness, nor unconsciousness, where there is neither this world nor a world beyond, or both together their moon and sun. This is no coming to birth, that is no going from life, there is no duration, there is no falling, there is no rising, there is not something fixed, and it is not on, it is not based on anything. That indeed is the end of ill. Here, inevitably metaphysical forms of thinking set in. Nirvana is said to be absence of duality, neither being nor non-being, as in the Upanishads, unknowable in the world where the worlds have methods, hence not an object of investigation, but the ultimate, most intense certainty. There's something unborn which has neither become, nor been made, nor been formed. If this were not, it would be impossible to find a way out, as in Parmenides. But by the very nature of speech, all speaking, this certainty must miss the mark. At this point, questioning ceases. Those who continue to inquire receive this answer. You have not known how to observe the limits of question, for Nirvana, the holy wandering, finds solid ground. Nirvana is its ultimate goal, Nirvana is its conclusion. Those who have not attained to Nirvana can only keep silence of their lot. He who has gone the rest, no measure can measure him. To speak of him, there are no words. What thought might comprehend has been annulled, so likewise has every path of discourse been annulled. Not metaphysics, but a way of salvation. All the ideas of which we have been speaking relate to redemption. Buddha rejects any knowledge that is not necessary to salvation. He declined to explain such propositions as the following. The world is eternal, and the world is not eternal. Or the world is finite, the world is not finite. Or the sand is after death, the sand is not after death. In other words, he dismissed the questions embodied in such statements. Buddha even regarded the theoretical treatment of metaphysical questions as harmful. It becomes a new fetter because metaphysical thinking claims the very forms of thought from which a man must free himself if he's to find a way to salvation. Metaphysical speculation results in quarrels and controversies, which leaders are going to own position as the only true one. But the main reason for declining to answer metaphysical questions is that they do not advance us along the road to nirvana. They bar the way to redemption. It is as if a man had been wounded by an arrow thickly seared poison, and his friends would have procured him a physician, and the sick man would say, I will not have this arrow taken out until I learn the name of the man who wounded me, until I learn where the man who wounded me was from this or that village. That man would die without ever having learnt this. In exactly the same way, anyone who should say, I will not lead a religious life under the blessed one, until the blessed one shall explain to me either that the world is eternal, or the world is not eternal. That man would die before the blessed one had ever explained this to him. Whether the dogma of the world is eternal, or the world is not eternal, there still remain birth, old age, sorrow, limitation, misery, grief, and despair. For the extension of which in the present life I am prescribing. Accordingly, bear always in mind what it is that I have not explained and why I have not explained it. His refusal to speak these things, says Buddha, does not mean he does not know them. The power of silence that plays so large a part in Buddha's life is wonderfully effective in the communication of his thinking. But not touching on all these ultimate things, he leaves them open. His silence concerned does not spirit them away, but leaves them perceptible as a vast background. It is considered possible to find it in the world, the path by which will disappear. Knowledge cannot with the traveling of this path that's imparted, but we must humbly forego the knowledge of being as a whole. So that was College Jaspers, highly recommended. I love this little book right here. It's also, honestly, just a really good intro to philosophy. All right, really good intro to philosophy there. If a good short intro to philosophy, if you want a longer intro to philosophy, I would recommend Modern Philosophy of Roger Scruton. On to the Dhammapada. Talk about the self. Self, I'm inner self, has stirred more controversy than any other subject in the Buddhist teaching. Several times throughout the Pali Canon, the Buddha says that the human being is a Natman without a self, thus apparently contradicting a principle that is the very basis of the Hindu faith. That the core of every creature is a divine self, Atman, which is not different from the transcendent reality, Brahman, and is therefore utterly beyond the world of change and death. Discussing how a transcendent self can relate to an impermanent personality naturally plunged any philosophers into deep metaphysical waters. But the Buddha never indulged in metaphysics. His concern was relentlessly practical. Life is full of suffering, the cause of that suffering is selfishness, and selfishness can be removed by practicing the Eightfold Path. Anything else is a distraction. And what lay beyond the impermanent world of ego and change, his attitude was simply first go there, then you will see for yourself. On one occasion, a monk asked the Buddha if a belief in a permanent self can prove harmful. The Buddha replied that it can. Suppose, he explained, that a man has the following view. Universe is that self, and I shall be that after death, permanent, abiding, everlasting, unchanging. I shall exist as that for eternity. Then he hears the Tathagata, the Buddha, the Sapo preaching that Dharma, which aims at the destruction of all views, the extinction of craving, and attachment, stopping, and nirvana. Then that man thinks, I'll be annihilated, destroyed, and be no more. So he mourns and laments and weeps, beating his breast, and becomes confused. Those among there's a possibility that one will become tormented with something permanent, but one itself is not found. Scholars and Orthodox Buddhists alike have cited such as proof that the Buddha denied the existence of a self, a permanent self, beyond all change and affected by death. Others cite more affirmative statements to assert that the Buddha did believe in the self. In the Dhammapada, he exhorts us to rely solely on ourselves and seek no other support. Part of the ambiguity lies in the language. Depending on the context, the Sanskrit word Atman can mean self in the conventional sense of myself and yourself, or it can refer to the transcendent self of the Upanishads. Hundreds of books have debated which the Buddha was denying, self or self, so that many maintain his stand on self to be the most distinct mark of his teaching. It is, however, hard to imagine that the Buddha himself was interested in this controversy. His concern wasn't in putting an end to self, that is, an end to ego. Nagarjuna, the brilliant Buddhist dialectician of the 2nd century, claimed that self was used by the Buddha only as a teaching device, and he actually took no stand whatever on it. There's a teaching of self, and there's a teaching of not self. But by the Buddhism, the self or not self has been taught as something that exists. He did not raise the question at all, had no bearing on the actual practice of the Eightfold Path. When a wanderer of Akagata came asking about the existence of the self, for example, the Buddha would not even give him an answer. This occasion, called the Buddha's Noble Silence, contains his real answer to all metaphysical speculation. They're probably the most brilliant intellect of his time. The Buddha maintained no intellectual positions whatever. They would be counter to his only purpose, which is to inspire greater effort in spiritual practice. How can intellectual opinions about the unity of life help a person as long as he believes he's a separate ego? What difference does his opinion about eternity make as long as he's so caught up in time? By offering no metaphysical supports, the Buddha prompts us to plunge deep in meditation and see for ourselves what we discover. His emphasis is on putting forth utmost effort to develop self-reliance. In one of the most celebrated statements on this theme, he addresses these words to the disciple Nanda. Therefore, Nanda, having self for an island, self for refuge for no other, having Dharma for an island, Dharma for refuge for no other. Oh, the perfect island, right? Dharma follows, yeah. The self he speaks of is the human will, only self worthy of strengthening and cultivation. Self. If you hold yourself dear, guard yourself diligently, keep Vigil during one of the rewatches at night, learn what is right, and teach others as the wise do. Before trying to guide others, be your own God first. It is hard to learn to guide oneself. Your own self is your master. Who else could be? With yourself well controlled, you gain a master very hard to find. The evil done by the selfish crushes them as a diamond breaks a hard gem. As a vine overpowers a tree, evil overpowers those who do evil, trap them in a situation that only their enemies will wish them to be in. Evil deeds which harm the doer are easy to do, good deeds are not so easy. Foolish people who scoff at the teaching of the wise, and noble and the good, following false doctrines, bring about their own downfall, like the kataka tree, which dies after bearing fruit. By oneself is evil done. By oneself one is injured. Do not do evil, and suffering will not come. Everyone has the choice to be pure or impure. No one can purify another. Don't neglect your own duty for another. Have a great. Know your own duty and perform it. Okay, so talking about the self. All right, let's get a little selfish here. I guess, even though Buddha, not with that selfishness, right? We're going to get selfish. The order to love thy neighbor is mild and yet stern, a reminder of one's duty to others. The order to love thy neighbor as thyself is too extreme and too sternness to be obeyed, as is the hard to interpret instruction, I love others as I've loved you. All right, we're going to tie that on each other. A criticism of decadence morality. An altruistic morality, a morality under which egoism languishes, is under all circumstances a bad sign. This applies to individuals, it applies especially to peoples. The best are lacking when egoism begins to be lacking. The choose what is harmful to oneself to be attracted by disinterested motives almost constitutes a formula for decadence. Not to seek one's own advantage, that is merely more figly for quite different than a physiological fact. I no longer know how to find my advantage. This aggregation of the instincts, man is finished when it becomes altruistic. Instead of saying simply, I'm no longer worth anything, the moral lie in the mouth of the decadent says, nothing is worth anything. Life is not worth anything. The beasts, the trees. Such a judgment represents, after all, a grave danger. It is contagious in an early morbid soul society, soon was up luxury, now in the form of religion, Christianity, now not a philosophy, Schopenhauerism. In some circumstances, the vapors of such a poison tree jungle sprung up out of future fashion can poison life for years ahead, for thousands of years ahead. God is not great. How religion poisons everything. With this one, I recommend the video by Black Ponder talking about this book right here. It's the same copy as me. Which matters. Humans are not so constituted as to care for others as much as themselves. The thing simply cannot be done, as any intelligent creator will understand from studying his own design. Urging humans to be superhumans on pain of death and torture is the urging of terrible self-abasement at their repeated and inevitable failure to keep the rules. What a grin, meanwhile, in the face of this, except the cash conditions are made label. The so-called golden rule, sometimes used to identify with the folktale about the Babylonian Rabbi Hillel, simply enjoins us to treat others as one wish to be treated by them. This sober and rational precept, which one can teach any child with his innate sense of fairness, and which predicts all Jesus' beauties and parables, is one within the compass of any atheist, and does not require masochism of Sarah, sadism of Sarah when it is breached. It is gradually learned as part of the painfully slow evolution of the species, and once grasped is never forgotten. Ordinary conscience will do without any heavenly wrath behind it. I guess ordinary punishment will do without the anger behind it. So I guess Hitchens just doesn't like it when you punish people with anger. I can see where it's coming from there. As to the basis rules, one need only consult the argument from design. Once more, we were talking about that earlier, such a paradoxical religion. People wish to enrich and better themselves, and though they may well lend or even give money to a friend or relative in need and ask for nothing but its eventual return or its grateful acknowledgement, they will not advance money to perfect strangers without expecting interest. By a nice chance, greeting their neighbors for the sphere of the economic development. No student of the subject from David Ricardo to Karl Marx, Adam Smith has been unaware of this fact. It is not from the benevolence of the baker, observed Smith in a shrewd Scots manner, that we expect our daily bread, but from his self-interest in baking and selling it. In any case, one may choose to be altruistic, whatever that may mean, but by definition, one may not be compelled to altruism. Perhaps we would be better mammals if we were not made this way, but surely nothing could be sillier than having a maker who then forbade the very same instinct he instilled. Free will, reply the casuist. You do not have to obey the laws against murder or theft either. Well, one may be genetically programmed for a certain amount of aggression and hatred and greed, and yet also evolved enough to be aware of following every prompting. If we gave in to our every base instinct every time, civilization would have been impossible, and there would have been no writing on which to continue this argument. However, there could be no question that a human being, whether standing up or lying down, finds his or her hand resting just next to the genitalia. Useful, no doubt, in warding off removal aggressors once our ancestors decided to take the risk of going erect and exposing a viscera. This is both a privilege and a prolongation, denied the most quadruped, some of whom can compensate by getting their mouths to the same point that we can reach with our fingers and palms. Now, who devised the rule that this easy opposition between the animal and the genital be forbidden, even as a thought? To put it more plainly, who ordered that you must touch for other reasons having nothing to do with sex or reproduction, but you also must not? There does not even seem to be any true scriptural authority here, yet almost all religions have made the prohibition near absolute one. Okay, so time for Hitchens' enemy. Dilemma. I'm going to reject everything that was just said. You ready for this, folks? The question of human nature. Over the past few decades, the Dalai Lama's view of the underlying compassionate nature of human beings seems to be slowly gaining ground in the West, although it has been a struggle. The notion that human behavior is essentially egoistic, that fundamentally we're all out for ourselves, is deeply ingrained in Western thought. The idea that not only are we inherently selfish, but also that aggression and hostility are part of basic human nature has dominated our culture for centuries. Of course, historically, there were plenty of people who were the opposite view. For instance, in the mid-1700s, David Hume wrote a lot about the natural benevolence of human beings. And a century later, even Charles Darwin himself attributed an instinct of sympathy to our species. Both races. Here's one of my controversial takes. Aaron Ross is going to disagree with me. Fess up, Aaron Ross. Charles Darwin was racist. But for some reason, a more pessimistic view of humanity has taken root in our culture, at least since the 17th century. Under the influence of philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, who had a pretty dark view of the human species, he saw the human race as being violent, competitive, in continual conflict, and concerned only with self-interest. Hobbes, who was famous for discounting any notion of basic human kindness, was once caught giving money to a beggar on the street. When questioned about this generous impulse, he claimed, "I'm not doing this to help him. I'm just doing this to relieve my own distress at seeing the man's poverty." Similarly, in the earlier part of the century, the Spanish-born philosopher George Santayana wrote that generous, caring impulses, while they may exist, are generally weak, fleeting, and unstable in human nature. But dig a little beneath the surface, and you'll find a ferocious, persistent, profoundly selfish man. Unfortunately, Western science and psychology grabbed hold of ideas like that, then sanctioned and even encouraged this egoistic view. Beginning in the early stages of modern scientific psychology, there was a general underlying assumption that all human motivation is essentially egoistic, based purely on self-interest. After explicitly accepting the premise of our essential selfishness, a number of very prominent scientists over the past 100 years have added to this a belief in the essential aggressive nature of humans. Freud claimed that the inclination to aggression is an original, self-subsisting, instinctual disposition. In the latter half of the century, two writers, in particular Robert Aldrich and Conrad Lorenz, looked at patterns of animal behavior in certain predator species and concluded that humans were basically predators as well, with an innate or instinctive drive to fight over territory. In recent years, however, the tide appears to be turning on this profoundly pessimistic view of humanity, coming closer to the Dalai Lama's view of our underlying nature as gentle and compassionate. Over the past 2 or 3 decades, there have been literally hundreds of scientific studies indicating that aggression is not essentially innate and that violent behavior is influenced by a variety of biological, social, situational, and environmental factors. Perhaps the most comprehensive statement on the latest research was summarized in the 1986 Civil Statement on Violence that was drawn up inside by 20 top scientists from around the world. In that statement, they of course acknowledged that violent behavior does occur, but they categorically stated that it is scientifically incorrect to say that we have an inherited tendency to make war or act violently. That behavior is not genetically programmed with human nature. They said that even though we have the neural apparatus to act violently, that behavior isn't automatically activated. There's nothing in our neurophysiology that compels us to act violently. In examining the subject of basic human nature, most researchers in the field currently feel that fundamentally we have the potential to develop into gentle, caring people or violent, aggressive people. The impulse that gets emphasized is largely a matter of training. Contemporary researchers have refuted not only the idea of humanity's innate aggression, but the idea that humans are innately selfish and egoistic has also come under attack. Investigators such as C. Daniel Batson and Nancy Eisenberg at Arizona State University have conducted numerous studies over the past 3 years that demonstrates that humans have a tendency toward altruistic behavior. Some scientists, such as sociologist Dr. Linda Wilson, seek to discover why this is so. She has theorized that altruism may be part of our basic survival instinct, the very opposite to ideas of earlier thinkers who theorized that hostility and aggression were the hallmark of our survival instinct. Looking at over 100 natural disasters, Dr. Wilson found a strong pattern of altruism among disaster victims, which seemed to be part of the recovery process. She found that working together to help each other tended to ward off later psychological problems that might have resulted from the trauma. The tendency to closely bond with others, acting for the welfare of others as well as oneself, may be deeply rooted in human nature. Forged in the remote past as those who bonded together and became part of a group had an increased chance of survival. This need to form close social ties persists up to the present day. In studies such as one conducted by Dr. Larry Shortwitz, examining the risk factors for coronary heart disease, it has been found that the people who were most self-focused, those who refer to themselves as using the pronouns I, me, and my most often in an interview, were more likely to develop coronary heart disease, even when other health-threatening behaviors were controlled. Scientists are discovering that those who lack slow social ties seem to suffer from poor health, higher levels of unhappiness, and a greater vulnerability to stress. Reaching out to help others may be as fundamental to our nature as communication. One could draw an analogy with the development of language, which, like the capacity for compassion and altruism, is one of the most magnificent features of the human race. Particular areas of the brain are specifically devoted to the potential for language. If we're exposed to the correct environmental conditions, that is, a society that speaks, then those discrete areas of the brain begin to develop and mature, and our capacity for language grows. In the same way, all humans may be endowed with the seed of compassion. When exposed to the right conditions at home and society at large, and later perhaps through our own pointed efforts, that seed will flourish. With this idea in mind, researchers are now seeking to discover the optimal environmental conditions that will allow the seed of caring and compassion to ripen in children. They have identified several factors: having parents who are able to regulate their own emotions, who model caring behavior, who set appropriate limits on the child's behavior, who communicate that a child is responsible for her or his own behavior, and who use reasoning to help direct the child's attention to affective or emotional states and the consequences of her or his behavior on others. Thank you for the wisdom, Dalai Lama. Did you hear all those redactions? Oh my God. Hitchens and Nietzsche got pwned, right, folks? Or when, I suffer. That's when you get rid of suffering. I'm egoist. I'm egoism. I'm egotistical. That's when you get rid of egoism. Or no, I'm not egotistical. That's when I'm proud. You can do it the other way too. You can do this all day. All right, let's get back into the Dhammapada. What is the path? What is the path, Dalai Lama? Of past, the eightfold is the best. Of truths, the noble four are best. Of mental states, detachment is the best. Of human beings, the illumined one is best. This is the path. There is no other that leads to purification of the mind. Follow this path and conquer them out. This path will lead to the end of suffering. This is the path I made known as the eras of sorrow fell away. All the effort must be made by you. Buddhists only show the way, follow this path, and practice meditation, go beyond the power of matter. All created things are transitory. Those who realize this are free from suffering. This is the path that leads to pure wisdom. All creating beings are involved in sorrow. Those who realize this are freed from suffering. This is the path that leads to pure wisdom. All states are without self. Those who realize this are freed from suffering. This is the path that leads to pure wisdom. Now is the time to wake up when you are young and strong. Those who wait and waver with a weak will and a divided mind will never find the way to pure wisdom. Guard your thoughts, words, and deeds. These 3 disciplines will speed you along the path to pure wisdom. Meditation brings wisdom. Lack of meditation leads to ignorance. Know well what leads you forward and what holds you back, and choose the path that leads to wisdom. Cut down the whole forest of selfish desires, not just one tree only. Cut down the whole forest, and you will be on your way to liberation. If there is any trace of lust in your mind, you are bound to life like a suckling calf to its mother. Pull out every selfish desire as you would an autumn lotus with your hand. Follow the path to nirvana with a God who knows the way. I will make this my winter home, have another house for the monsoon, and dwell in a third during the summer. Lost in such fancies, one forgets his final destination. Death comes and carries off a man absorbed in his family and possessions as the monsoon flood sweeps away a sleeping village. Neither children nor parents can rescue one whom death has seized. Remember this and follow without delay the path that leads to nirvana. Okay, I'm going to try to tie this into nature. Let's fix our suso. In happy isles, the figs fall from the trees, they're good and sweet, and falling the red skins and break. A north wind to ripe figs. Thus like figs to these toxins. Fall for you, my friends, and bind now their juice in a sweet substance. It is autumn all around, and clear sky and afternoon. Lo, what fullness is around us in the midst of superabundance, is a light for to look down upon distant seas. Once the people say God when they look down upon distant seas. Now, however, have I taught you to say Superman. God is a conjecture, but that not reach your conjecture to reach beyond your creating will. Could you create a God? Then I pray that be silent about all gods, but you can well create the Superman. Now perhaps you yourselves, my brethren, but to the fathers and forefathers of the Superman could you transform yourselves, and let that be your best creating. God is a conjecture, but I should like your conjecture restricted to conceive the conceivable. Could you conceive a God, but let us will the truth unto you, that everything be transformed into the humanly conceivable, the humanly visible, the humanly sensible. Your own servant shall you follow out to the end. The human will, the only self-worthy and strength in cultivation. And what ye have called the world shall but be created by you. Your reason, your likeness, your will, your love shall itself become, and verily for your bliss, you discerning ones. And how would you endure life without that hope, you discerning ones? None of the inconceivable could have been born, nor the irrational. But then I reveal my heart entirely unto you, my friends. If there were gods, how could there be no God? Therefore there are no gods. Yeah, I've drawn the conclusion now, however, doth it draw me. Alright, back to racist. Ugh. Racist poopy head. With the good philosophy, right? Just like Charles Darwin, this is what I say. So, Charles Darwin, racist. David Hume, racist. However, Darwinism, distinct from his racism. David Hume's philosophy, distinct from his racism. That's my view. Don't you remember, said Philo, the excellent saying of Lord Bacon in his head, that a little philosophy, replied Cleanthes, makes man an atheist a great deal in comparison to religion. That is a very judicious remark, too, said Philo. But half of my eyes, another passage where having mentioned David's fool, who said in his heart there is no God, this great philosopher observes that the atheists nowadays have a double share of folly. For they are not content to say in their hearts there is no God, but they also utter their impiety with their lips, and are thereby guilty of milk, dependence, discretion, and prudence. Such people, they were ever so much in earnest, cannot be things to be very formidable. God is a conjecture, but who could drink all bitterness of this conjecture without dying? Shall his faith be taken from the creating one, and from the eagle his flights and eagle heights? God is a thought, and maketh all the straight crooked, and all that standeth real. What time will be gone, all the peril shall be but a lie? To think this was goodness and vertigo to human limbs, and even vomit into the stomach. Verily, the ruling sickness do I call it, to conjecture such a thing. Evil do I call it, misanthropic. All the teaching about the one and the plume and the unmoved, and the sufficient and the imperishable. All the imperishable, this would assemble, and the poets lie too much. But of time and of becoming shall the best simile speak, a praise shall they be, and a justification of all perishableness. Creating, that is a great salvation from suffering and lies alleviation, but for the Creator to appear suffering itself is neither much transformation. Yet much bitter die must be in life, you creators. Thus he advocates and justifiers of all perishableness. For to create himself to be the newborn child, he must also be willing to be the childbearer and bear the pangs of the childbearer. Verily, through 100 souls went on my way, and through 100 cradles and birth woes, many a farewell have I taken, another heartbreaking last hours. But so willeth it my creating will, my fate, or to tell it more candidly, just as her fate willeth my will, All feelings suffer than me and is in prison, but my willing number comfort me as my emancipator and comforter. Willing emancipator, that is a true doctrine of will emancipation. So she chooses Zarathustra. No longer willing and no longer valuing and no longer creating, that the great ability may ever be far from me. And also discerning that I feel only my will is procreating and involving delight, and if there be innocence in my knowledge, it is because there is will to procreation in it. Away from God and God's is will learn me. What would be the create if there were gods? Which man doth it ever help me, and knew my perfect creator will, thus impel the hammer to the stone. I even within this lone stone with an image for me, the image of my visions. That is just one of the hardest of the stone. Now ridges my hammer ruthlessly against this person. From the stone fly the fragments. What's that? I will complete for the shadow came unto me, the stillest and lightest of all things once came unto me. The beauty of Superman came unto me as a shadow. My brethren, what account now are the gods to me? Thus spoke Zarathustra. That's upcoming. Oh my goodness. Pretty cool stuff. Alright, we're going to get back into more Nietzsche here. The error of free will. We no longer have any sympathy today with the concept of free will. We know only too well what it is. The most infamous of all the arts of the theologian for making mankind accountable, in the sense of the word, that is to say, for making mankind dependent on him. I give here only the psychology of making man accountable. Everywhere accountability is sought. It is usually the instinct for punishing and judging what seeks it. One is the pride becoming of its innocence, if being in this or that state is traced back to will, to intentions, to accountable acts. The doctrine of will has been invented essentially for the purpose of punishment. That is, of finding guilty. Now, remember, it is denounciation and punishment for their own good of those who interest. And the collectivization of guilt. Oh, yeah, he also knows about that too. The whole also psychology, the psychology of will, has as its precondition the desire of its authors. The priests at the head of the ancient community, that is great for themselves, are right to ordain punishers, or the desire the great for God a right to do so. Men were thought of as free, so they come guilty. Consequently, every action had to be thought of as will. The origin of every action is lying in the consciousness, whereby the most fundamental falsification of psychologicus was made to the very principle of psychology. Today, when we have started to move in the reverse direction, when we moralists especially are trying with all their might to remove the concept of guilt and punishment from the world, and purge psychology, history, nature, social institutions, and sanctions of them, there is in our eyes no more radical opposition than that of the theologians, who continue to, in fact, the innocence becoming a punishment and guilt by means of the concept of the moral order. Christianity is a hangman's metaphysics. Alright. Time for something pretty cool in this professor on my Christian book. Every time I go through this, it's like an experience, more problem. Ready for this one, folks? Then you come to more questions. There's one very serious defect in my mind across moral character, and that is that he believed in hell. I did not myself feel that any person who's really profoundly humane can believe in everlasting punishment. Christ, certainly speaking in the Gospels, did believe in everlasting punishment. And one does find repeatedly a vindictive fury against those people who would not listen to his preaching. And that too, which is not uncommon with preachers, but which does somewhat detract from superlative excellence. You know, that, for instance, find that attitude in Socrates. You find him quite blunt in the banter that people would not listen to him. And this, in my mind, far more worthy of a sage to take that line than to take the line of indignation. You probably all remember the sort of things that Socrates was saying when he was dying, and the sort of things that he generally did. So to people who do not agree with him, what did Socrates say? I'm not angry with my condemners or my accusers. They have done me no harm, although they did not mean to do me any good. Ever thus I may blame them. Silent faces sometimes. The enemy will do you no harm, because you know where he's coming from. You will find that in the Gospels Christ said, Ye serpents, you generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell? That was said to people who did not like his preaching. It's not really to my mind quite the best turn, and there are a great many of these things about hell. There's, of course, a familiar text about the sin against the Holy Ghost. Whosoever sinneth against the Holy Ghost, it shall not be forgiven him neither in this world or in the world to come. That text is called an unspeakable amount of misery in the world, for all sorts of people have imagined that they have committed the sin against the Holy Ghost and thought that it would not be forgiven them either in this world or in the world to come. I really do not think that a person with a proper degree of kindness and his nature would put fears and terrors of that sort in the world. Here's my question. If I could speak against the Son of Man and be forgiven, why can't I speak against God and be forgiven? That's what I always ask. Then Christ says, The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. And it goes on about the wailing and gnashing of teeth. It comes in one verse after another. And it's quite manifest that there is a certain pleasure in contemplating wailing and gnashing of teeth. Or it's one that occurs so often. Okay, then I'm going to put hedges in here. Does Jesus say, does he not say, I'm going to bring out peace but a sword? He does say that. Shall I take a little metaphorically? Then, you all, of course, remember about the sheep and the goats. At the Son coming, who's going to divide the sheep from the goats? And he's going to say, the goats depart from me, be cursed in everlasting fire. He continues, and he shall go away in the everlasting fire. Then he says again, if thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter life maimed than having two hands to go into hell into the fire that never shall be quenched, where the worm doth not, the fire is not quenched. If he said again and again also, I must say that I think all this doctrine, hellfire is a punishment for sin, is a doctrine of cruelty. It is a doctrine of cruelty into the world that gave the world generations of cruel torture, and the Christ of the Gospels, if you could take him as his chronicler's representative, would certainly have to be considered partly responsible for that. There are other things of less importance. All right, you ready for my number one problem with Christianity, folks? It's not the everlasting fire. It's this. It was an instance of the Gadarene swine, where it certainly was not very kind to the pigs that put the devils into them to make them rush down the hill to the sea. You must remember that he was omnipotent. He just stopped the storm with his lips. And he could have made the devil simply go away. He could have made Legion simply disappear. But he chose to send them to the pigs. He chose to corrupt the innocent. 2,000 is less than 3,000, right? The least of these brothers and sisters of mine. Whoever sets aside one of the least of these commandments will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. That's why Socrates and Buddha got put above you, buddy. Then, there's a curious story of the fig tree, which always rather puzzled me. You remember what happened about the fig tree? He was hungry and seeing a fig tree afar off half leaves. He came to happily might find anything thereon. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves. For the time of figs was not yet. And Jesus answered and said unto it, No man eat fruit of thee hereafter forever. And Peter said to him, Master, behold, the fig tree was so cursed. This is what of the way. Okay, I'm going to get Asian here. I call Christianity one great curse. What's that? The money changers, nothing but money? I was blamed, but I took the blame for the sins of the money changers, which I took no part to the fig tree. This is a very curious story because it was not the right time of year for figs, and you really could not blame the tree. All right, I'm going to get St. Augustine in here. Christ himself shows refrain from the killing of animals and destroying of plants as a height of superstition. For such as not to come rise between us and the beasts and trees, so the devils and herd of swine, or the curse with the tree which he found no fruit. Surely the swine had not sinned, nor had the tree. I guess if you're Catholic, slaughtering the innocent is called healing. I cannot myself feel that either in a matter of wisdom and a matter of virtue, Christ stands quite as high as some of the people in the history. I think I should put Buddha and Socrates above him in those respects. So, yeah, that was a pretty cool part of the book right there. All right. Next up. Wherever there are walls, I shall inscribe this eternal accusation against Christianity upon them. I can write in letters which make even the blind see. I call Christianity the one great curse, the one great intrinsic depravity, the one great instinct for revenge, which no expedient sufficiently poisonous, secret, subterranean, petty. I call it the one immortal blemish in mankind. Christian and anarchist. When the anarchist is a mouthpiece of the clandestine society demands his righteous indignation, his rights, justice, equal rights, he's only acting under the influence of his want of culture, which prevents his understanding why he's really suffering. In what respect he's impoverished in life. A cause-creating drive is powerful within him. Someone must be to blame for his feeling vile. His righteous indignation itself already does him good. Every poor devil finds pleasure in scolding. It gives him a little the intoxication of power. Even complaining and well can give life a charm for the sake of which one endures it. There's a small dose of revenge in every complaint. One reproaches those who are different for one's feeling vile, sometimes even with one's being vile, as if they have perpetuated injustice or possess an impermissible privilege. A violent criminality ought to be so too. On the basis of this logic, one makes revolutions. Well, complaining is never of any use. It comes from weakness. Whether one attributes one's feeling vile to others or oneself, the social sense of form of the Christian, for example, the latter makes no essential difference. What is common to both, and unworthy of both, is that someone has to be to blame for the fact that one suffers. In short, that the sufferer prescribes for himself the honey of revenge as a medicine for his suffering. The objectives of this thirst for revenge as a thirst for pleasure vary according to the circumstances. The sufferer finds occasions everywhere for cooling his petty revengefulness. If he is a Christian, I say it again, he finds them in himself. The Christian and anarchist both are decadents. And when a Christian condemns, culminates, and befoul the world, he does so from the same instinct from which the socialist worker condemns, culminates, and befoul society. Even the last judgment is still the sweet consolation of revenge. The revolution, such as the socialist worker too anticipates, only conceived of as somewhat more distant. Even the beyond. Why beyond, if not as a means of befouling here and now? Everyone is a child of God. Jesus definitely claims nothing for himself alone. As a child of God, everyone is equal to everyone else. To make a hero of Jesus. So what a worse misunderstanding is the word genius. Our old concept, the cultural concept, spirit had no meaning whatever in the world Jesus lived in. To speak with the precision that physiologists, quite different word would rather be placed here, the word idiot. Equality of souls before God. This falsehood, this pretext for the rancune of all the base mind, that this explosive concept, which finally became a revolution, modern idea, and the principle of the decline of the entire social order, is Christian dynamite. Humanitarian blessings of Christianity. The cultivate out of humanity is a self-contradiction, an art of self-violation with a falsehood at any price. An antipathy, a contempt for every good and honest instinct. These are the blessings of Christianity. Parasitism is the sole practice of the church, which is a deal of growing sickness, of holiness, draining away all blood, all love, all hope for life. The beyond is will to deny reality of every kind. The cross is the badge of recognition for the most subterranean conspiracy there has ever been. A conspiracy against health, beauty, will, constituents, bravery, intellect, benevolence of soul, against life itself. Now, I'm going to blow your socks off with God's omnipotence, alright? Ready? Missions? The suicide bombing community is entirely faith-based. That martyrs prove anything about the truth of a cause is so little true, I would be supposed and deny that a martyr has ever had anything whatever to do with truth. In a turn to which a martyr throws his opinion at the world's head, there's not expressed so low a degree of intellectual integrity, such obtuseness to the question of truth that one never needs to refute a martyr. Truth is not something one person might possess and another not possess. Peasants at the most, or peasant apostles like Luther, could think of truth in this fashion. One may be certain that modesty, moderation, and intellectual matters increases with a degree of conscientiousness in them. To know 5 things don't decline than anything else. Truth is every prophet, every sectarian, every latitudinarian, every socialist, every churchman understands a word. Is conclusive proof that not so much as a sword has been made on the disciplining of the intellect and self-becoming necessary to discovery of any truth, even the very smallest. Martyrdoms, by the way, have been a great misfortune in history. They have seduced the efforts of all idiots, women and nations included, that a cause for which someone is willing to die, not to speak of those which, like primitive Christianity, produce epidemics of destiny, must have something in it. This inference has become an unspeakable drag of verification, the spirit of verification and caution. Martyrs have found truth, and even today, crucial to persecution is all that is squared equate normal name for any sect, no matter how indefinite itself. What? Does the fact that someone gives up his life for it change anything in a valuable cause? An error which becomes honorable is an error which possesses one seductive turmoil. You believe, Monsieur, as the theologians, that we have given the opportunity of becoming martyrs for your lives. One refutes to think about laying it respectful on us. Just as one refute theologians, too. The world still calls the stupidity of our persecutors as imprecise and given their appearance the appearance of ominous. I'm bestowing on them the fascination of martyrdom. I want to say on her knees before now because she's been told the soul when died on the cross. But is the cross an argument? And all these things, one minute on the said the word has been wanting from the Zarathustra. The road is the blood in the path they followed, and the fall they taught that truth is proved by blood. But blood is the worst witness of truth. Blood poisons and transforms the pure teaching and delusion and hatred of the heart. And this all goes through fire for his teaching. What does that prove? Truly, it is more when one's own teaching comes out of one's own burning. All right. Let's talk about those priests. The priests. And one day Zarathustra made a sign to his disciples and spoke these words unto them. Here are priests, but although they are mine enemies, pass them quietly with sleeping swords. Even among them there are heroes. Many of them have suffered too much, so they want to make others suffer. Bad enemies are they. Nothing is more revengeful than their meekness, and rarely doth he show himself and touch them. But my blood is related to theirs, and I want withal to see my blood honored in theirs. And when they had passed, a pain attacked Zarathustra, but not long he struggled with the pain when he began to speak thus. It moveth my heart for those priests. They also go against my taste, but that's the smallest matter unto me, since I am among them. What I suffer and have suffered with them, prisoners are they unto me, as stigmatized ones. He whom they call Savior put them in fetters. In fetters of false vows and fabulous words. Oh, that someone would save them from their Savior. On all they once thought they had landed when the sea tossed them about, but behold, it was a slumbering monster. False vows and fatuous words, these are the worst monsters for mortals. Long summereth and waiteth the fate that is in them. But at last it cometh and awaketh and devoureth and engulfeth whatever hath built tabernacles upon it. Oh, just look at those tabernacles which those priests have built themselves. Churches, they call their sweet-smelling caves. Oh, the falsified light, the mussified air, the soul may not fly aloft to its height. But so enjoineth their belief on knees at the stairs. Verily, rather would I see a shameless one than the sordid eyes of their shame and devotion, who created for themselves such caves and pits and stairs. Was it not those who sought to conceal themselves and were ashamed under the clear sky? And only when the clear sky looketh again through ruined roofs, down upon grass and mud poppies on ruined walls, will I again turn my heart to the seats of this God. They called God that which opposed and afflicted them, and verily there was much hero spirit in their worship, and they knew not how to love their God otherwise than by nailing men to the cross. As courses they thought to live in black drape they their corpses, even in their talk do I still feel the evil flavor of eternal houses. And he who liveth not unto them liveth not unto black pools, wherein the toad singeth his song with sweet gravity. Better songs would they have to sing for me to believe in their Savior. More like saved ones would his disciples have to appear unto me. Naked would I like to see them, for beauty alone should preach penitence. But whom would that disguised affliction convince? Verily, their Saviors themselves came not from freedom and freedom of seventh heaven. Verily, they themselves never trod the carpets of knowledge. Of defects of the spirit of those Saviors consists, but in every defect had they put their illusion, their stopgap, which they called God. In their pity was their spirit drowned, and when they swelled and were swelled with pity, there always floated to the surface a great folly. eagerly and with shouts to lead their flock over the footbridge, as if there were but one footbridge to the future. Verily, those shepherds also were still the flock. Small spirits and spacious souls had those shepherds, but my brethren, what small domains have even the most spacious souls hitherto been? Characters of blood did they write on the way they went, and their folly taught the truth is proved by blood. But blood is the very worst witness to truth. Blood tainteth the purest teaching, and turneth it into illusion, hatred of heart. And when a person go through fire for his teaching, what doth that prove? It is more verily when out of one's own burning cometh one's own teaching. Sultry heart and cold head, where these meet, there riseth the bluster, the Saviour. Greater ones verily have there been, and higher born ones than those whom the people call saviors, those rapturous blusterers. And by still greater ones than any of the saviors must ye be saved, my brethren, if you would find the way to freedom. Never yet hath there been at Syrian, never naked have I seen both of them, the greatest man and the smallest man. All too similar are they still to each other. Rarely even the greatest found I. All too human. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Alrighty, know what's next? Gene Missler. Oh boy, here we go. So this dude is about to diss on Jesus Christ. Okay, here we go. Of Jesus Christ, the priest God. If closing our eyes upon all that transpires in this world, we shall rely upon the frontiers of the Christian religion, we will believe that the coming of our divine Savior has produced a most wonderful revolution and a most complete reform in the Muslim nations. The Messiah, according to Pascal, see thoughts of Pascal, ought of himself alone to produce a great select and holy people, conducting and nourishing it, and introducing it into the place of repose and sanctity, bringing it holy to God, making it the temple of God, saving it from the wrath of God, delivering it from a servitude of sin, giving laws to these people, engraving these laws upon their hearts, offering himself to God for them, crushing the head of the serpent, etc. This great man has forgotten to show us the people upon whom his divine Messiah has produced miraculous effects, of which he speaks with so much emphasis. So far it seems they do not exist upon the earth. If we examine ever so little the morals of the Christian nations and listen to the clamors of their priests, we'd be obliged to conclude that their God, Jesus Christ, preached without fruit, without success, that his Almighty will still finds in men a resistance over which this God either cannot or does not wish to triumph. The morality of this divine doctrine, which his disciples have learned so much and practiced so little, is followed during a whole century but by half a dozen of obscure saints, fanatical and ignorant monks, who alone will have the glory of shining like the sun in the celestial court. All the remainder of mortals, all the redeemed by the blood of this God, will be the prey of eternal flames. Yikes, okay. Alright, time to get political again with college aspers. If Jesus was not an active political leader, like the so-called zealots, if he desired no social revolution, if he did not seek a martyr's death as proof of his message, if he led the life of a believer when God's actually making no attempt to force God's hand, if he was far from the desire for suffering and aggrandizement, his whole life was an active obedience to God's will, his conduct becomes hard to understand. For by violence, consequent the temple creation of a movement among the people, he provoked violence against himself. What he suffered was a consequence of his act. In all this, there is a flavor of militancy, which is also unmistakable and a manifestation of his personality. All right. I'm going to do some crazy stuff here. I'm going to lump in Jesus with the totalitarian principle, the worst nightmare. Let's give it a shot. As techniques of government, the totalitarian devices appear simple and ingeniously effective. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. There sure none on an absolute power monopoly. All authority on heaven and earth has been given unto me. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except through me. How's it more to claim a monopoly on access to heaven? Who said that? Christopher Hitchens. But unparalleled certainty, faith that all commands will always be carried out. You can tell this mountain to jump into the scene at will. The multiplicity of the transmission bell. So the confusion of the hierarchy. Secure the dictators' complete independence of all his inferiors. Make possible the swift and surprising changes of policy for which totalitarianism has become famous. Jesus was a true progressive. The body politic of the country is shockproof because of its shapelessness. The spiritual body politic of the country is shockproof, right? Spiritual body, I guess. Country shockproof because of its shapelessness. Shapelessness is not clear. Just like Jesus' manner of communication. Jesus preaches not knowledge but faith. His remaining remains veiled for the unbeliever. Those who see may become blind. To the believer it is revealed, the blind will not see, yet even then not clear statements from parables and paradoxes. Question about the parables he replies, unto you it is given in the mystery of the kingdom of God, but unto them that are without, all these things are done in parables. Jesus speaks in concrete terms, expresses intelligible ideas, utters definite commandments. Without this effective communication would be impossible. But all his direct statements are vehicles of meaning which ultimately evades rational interpretation. Jesus shows a little concern for logical consistency. He says, for example, he that is not with me is against me, but for he is not against us on our part. On one hand, resist not evil, and on the other, I bring not peace but a sword. Where everything is a sign, there are no contradictions. His utterances do not represent a system of thought, but a message in signs. In his Antichrist, Nietzsche describes Jesus as a psychological type, hypersensitive, prone to suffering, and dreading it above all else. Thus, reality was intolerable to him. He could accept it only as a parable, a sign. The world he lived in was not a real world, but a world of vague, intangible symbols. Hostility, opposition, the resistance to concrete things were intolerable to him. For Nietzsche, this explains why he did not contend with the world and resist not evil as the key to the gospel. In this maxim, Jesus' personal incapacity for struggle is set up as an ethical principle. The only true reality is an inner reality, which is called life, truth, light. The kingdom of God is a psychological state. It is not expected, but is present everywhere and nowhere. It is a state of beauty which cannot be demonstrated by miracles by Scripture, which offers no promise or reward, but is its own proof, its own miracle and reward. Its fruits are inner lights, feelings of pleasure, and self-satisfaction. The problem is, how shall I live in order to feel that I'm in heaven at all times of honor, the child of God? For the sense of beatitude is a sole reality. Jesus is not a hero or a genius born in the nature of an idiot. Nietzsche apparently used the word in much the same sense as Dostoevsky. For Nietzsche, the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount with his beatitudes is utterly incompatible with Jesus, a fanatical militant, the daily enemy of the priests and theologians. Consequently, he ascribes everything in the Gospels that does not, so to speak, of Jesus to the invention of the early militant congregation, which required a militant prototype. It is doubtful whether anyone would be convinced by Nietzsche's interpretation. Remember, I first said, to top his eyes whole cell, to assume his thinking, that's not Nietzsche. I'm as far as I think it was. It's doubtful whether anyone would be convinced by Nietzsche's interpretation. That's right, Carl Jaspers. It is doubtful whether anyone would be convinced by Christofascism as well, right? The whole of Jesus cannot be found, for instance, if it says, true such creatures can be singled out of the gospel and other, but they're not the only ones. In the Gospels, Jesus appears as an elemental power, by turns unbendingly aggressive and infinitely gentle. He looked at them with anger, he assaulted them, he rebuked them, he menaced them. Finding new fruit on a fig tree, he withers it with his curse. No man should eat fruit of it forever thereafter. Those who do not do the will of the Father in heaven, Jesus will deny at the last judgment. I never knew you. Depart from me. They are cast out in darkness, and shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Whosoever shall deny me before men, him will also deny before my Father which is in heaven. Think not that I come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace but a sword. For I come to set a man advance against his father and a daughter against her mother. He reviles the cities that do not repent. Woe unto thee, Sarahs, and woe unto thee, Bethsaida. It shall be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon at the day of judgment than for you. When Peter's offended to hear that the Son of Man will suffer much, be killed, and rise again, Jesus rebukes him. Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou savest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men. Violently with a whip, he drives the money changers from the temple. Jesus can simply not be interpreted as passive, mob who would always know my love, much less as helpless and arrest in it. The strange reality of gentleness and uncompromising militancy is evident in the words with which Jesus demands faith. He could say, "Make his easy mind burn his light," but he can also command men to follow him once, without hesitation, without reservation. To the young man which is first to bury his father, he cries imperiously, "Follow me, and let the dead bury the dead." He curses the unbelievers in the words of Isaiah. "You shall hear and shall not understand, for these people's heart was wax gross." He gives thanks that God should defend the truth from the wise and prudent, and reveal it to babes. The certainty of his faith in God made possible for Jesus an attitude of soul, which in itself is incomprehensible. He lived in a world and partook of its simple existence, but moved by profound unworldly source. He was unmoved by the world. In the world, he transcends the world. Even while his life was given to the world, he was somehow invisibly and undemonstrably doubting it in his very statements, independent of the world. This independence of immersion in the world is the source of Jesus' wonderful serenity. On the one hand, worldly things can no longer tempt him than finite absolutes. Worldly husk of knowledge can no longer beguile him than total knowledge, nor the rules and laws and the calculable dogma. All these temptations shattered against the freedom of his faith in God. On the other hand, his own being was open to the world. His eye was alive to all realities, and particularly to the souls of men, the depths of their hearts, which conceal nothing from his insight. Once the idea of God, however, mysteriously penetrates the soul, there comes a fear of losing him and an unremitting impulse to do whatever might prevent God from disappearing. Hence, Jesus died to blessed a pure heart, where they trusted God. But then, something happened to Jesus, which in the Old Testament is present only in germ. And in the earnestness of the idea of God brought the most radical consequences. The God who for Jesus was not physically present, not in visions, not in voices, was able to put absolutely everything in the world in question. Everything in the world was drawn before his judgment seat. It was terrifying to see how this was done by Jesus and the certainty of his faith in God. Anyone who could read this in the synoptic gospels and yet remain easy in his mind, content with his existence and caught up in his routines, is blind. Jesus broke free from every practical order in the world. He saw the orders and habits have become pharisaical. He points to the source in which they melt to nothingness. All earthly realities is part of its foundation, absolutely and definitively. All orders whatsoever demands a piety of the law of reasonable custom collapse. Beside the commandment to follow God into the kingdom of heaven, all other tasks, earning of bread, with all the claims of justice and property become meaningless. To die at the hands of the powers of this world and suffering persecution and abuse degradation, that is what befits the believer. Never have words so revolutionary been spoken, for everything otherwise looked on as valid is represented as indifferent, unworthy of consideration. Hegel. All right. Now, let's go the judgment seat. Okay, we're going to get into the portable atheist. Talking with Einstein. It is quite possible that we can do greater things than Jesus. For what is written in the Bible about him is poetically embellished. I cannot conceive of a personal God who would directly influence the actions of individuals or would directly sit in judgment on creatures of his own creation. I cannot do this in spite of the fact that mechanistic causality has a certain instant place in doubt in modern science. He's speaking quantum mechanics and breaking down determinism. My religiosity consists in a humble admiration of the infinite superior spirit that reveals itself in a little that we, with our weak and transitory understanding, can comprehend of reality. Morality is of the highest importance, but for us, not for God. For us, not for God, back to Dhammapada. Wrong actions are central to the concept of papa, sin or evil. In Buddhism, there is no one sitting in judgment to punish us for wrong actions, nor is there anyone to reward us for good works. Instead, reward and punishment issue from the self-fulfilling law of karma, which permeates every aspect of the Buddhist teachings. Put simply, the law of karma states that as we sow, so shall we reap. Everything we do, say, or even think has consequences, good or bad, and sooner or later those consequences must come back to us. Karma was already an ancient in India when the Buddha taught, and considered we said is only so for granted that the law of cause and effect governs not only physical events, but every event in human experience. The Buddha expresses enlightenment, not as a meeting with God, an immersion in bliss, but as a symbol in the conditioned personality, and the exhilaration that comes with perfect freedom. All right. From the start, the Christian faith is a sacrifice of all freedom, all pride, all self-confidence of the spirit, at the same time enslavement and self-mockery, self-mutilation. There is cruelty and religious fanaticism in this faith, which is expected to have an overripe, multiple conscience. It presupposes that the subjection of the spirit hurts indescribably, that the whole past and happiness of the spirit resists ad absurdissimum, height of absurdity, which faith represents to it. The state of hatred of reality, consequence of a shrink capacity for suffering and irritation, which no longer wants to be touched at all, because it feels every contact too deeply. Instinct of exclusion of all aversion, all enmity, all fear, and limitation and distancing, consequence of a shrink capacity for suffering and irritation, which already feels all resisting, all need for resistance as an unbearable displeasure, that is to say, is harmful, as deprecated by the instinct of self-preservation, and knows blessedness, pleasure, only in no longer resisting anyone or anything. Now the evil of the evildoer, love is the soul, as the last possibility of life. These are the two physiological realities upon which adoption redemption is grown. Are called a sublime further evolution of hedonism on a thoroughly morbid basis. Closest related to it, even if with a considerable addition of Greek vitality and nervous energies, Epicureanism, the redemption doctrine of the pagan world. Epicurus, a typical decadent, first recognized as such by me. The fear of pain, even at infinitely small in pain, cannot end otherwise than in a religion of love. With my condemnation of Christianity, I should not like to have wronged a kindred religion, which even preponderance in a number of its believers. Buddhism. They belong together as nihilistic religions. They are decadent religions, but they are distinguished from one another in the most remarkable way. The critic of Christianity is profoundly grateful to Indian scholars that one is unable to compare these two religions. Buddhism is 100 times more realistic than Christianity. It has its heritage of a core objective posing on problems in its composition. It arises after a philosophical movement lasting hundreds of years. The concept of God is already abolished by the time it arrives. Buddhism is 100 times colder, more voracious, more objective. It no longer needs to make its suffering capacity for pain decent to itself by interpreting its sin. It merely says what it feels. I suffer. To the barbarian, on the contrary, suffering in itself is not decent. He first requires it to be interpreted before he will admit to himself that he suffers. His instinct directs him rather to deny he is suffering, to a silent endurance. Here the word devil was a blessing. One had an overwhelming and fearful enemy. One did not need to be ashamed of suffering at the hands of such an enemy. Buddhism is the only really positivistic religion history has to show us, even in its epistemology. It's strict phenomenalism. It no longer speaks to the struggle against sin, but quite in accordance with actuality, a struggle against suffering. It already has, and this distinguishes it profoundly from Christianity, the self-deception moral concepts behind it. It says in my language, beyond good and evil. The two physiological facts upon which it rests and on which it fixes its eyes are, firstly, an excessive excitability of sensibility, which expresses itself as a profound capacity for pain, then an awareness of actuality, a too great preoccupation with all concepts and logical procedures, on which a personal instinct has sustained harm. To the advantage of the impersonal, both of them conditions which, in any rate, some of the objective ones would know from experience as I do. On the basis of these physiological conditions, the state of depression has arisen. Against this, the person Buddha takes hygienic measures. He poses up with life in open air, the wandering life with moderation, if as an as regards food, with caution toward all emotions which produce gal, which eat the blood, no anxiety either for oneself or for others. He demands ideas which produce cheerfulness. He devises means for disaccustoming oneself to others. He understands benevolence being behind as health-promoting. Prayer is excluded, as is asceticism. No categorical imperative, no compulsion at all, not even within the monastic community one can leave it. All these would have the effect of increasing the excessive excitability. For this reason, too, he demands no struggle against those who think differently. His teaching resists nothing more than it resists the feeling of revengefulness, of antipathy and resentment. Enmity is not ended by enmity, the moving refrain of the whole. Buddhism, quite rightly, is precisely these emotions which would be truly unhealthy with regard to the main objective. The spiritual awareness he discovered, which expresses itself as an excessive objectivity, that is to say, weakening of individual interests, also center gravity of egoism. He combated by directing even the spiritual interest back to the individual person. In a teaching of Buddha, egoism becomes a duty. The one thing needful to how to get rid of suffering. You could say the suffering is egoism, how to get rid of egoism. Regulates and circumscribes the entire spiritual diet. One may perhaps call to mind that Athenian, who likewise made war on pure scientificality, Socrates, who avoided personal egoism to morality, even in the main of problems. Since we run those comparisons, let's get back to the card aspers. Let us compare Jesus and Buddha. Jesus' message is a part of history. Jesus' message is part of history brought by God. Those who go with Jesus are calm, and a passion that has its source in a moment of the most critical decision. Buddha proclaims his doctrine in endless wanderings and aristocratic serenity without insistence, and different to a world that is forever the same. Jesus builds on the Old Testament, Buddha on Hindu philosophy. Jesus demands faith, Buddha demands insight. Let us compare Jesus with Socrates. Jesus teaches by proclaiming the glad tidings, Socrates by compelling men to think. Jesus demands faith, Socrates in exchange of thought. Jesus speaks with direct earnestness, Socrates indirectly, even by irony. Jesus knows of the kingdom of heaven and eternal life, Socrates has no definite knowledge of these matters and leaves the question open. But neither will that man rest. Jesus proclaims the only way, Socrates leaves man free because reminding him of his responsibility rather than freedom. Both raise supreme claims. Jesus confers salvation, Socrates provokes men to look for it. Alright, now for another one of my favorite Christians. I have references. C.S. Lewis and Armstrong. The Gospels present Jesus as a distinct personality with idiosyncrasy, special turns of phrase, moments of profound emotion, short irascibility, and terror have been preserved. This is not true of the Buddha, who's presented as a type rather than as an individual. In his discourses, we find not a sudden quip, stress, and witticisms that aligns to the speech of Jesus to Socrates. He speaks as the Indian philosophical tradition of man, solemnly, formally, and in person. After his enlightenment, we get no sense of his likes and dislikes, his hopes and fears, moments of desperation, elation, or intense striving. What remains is an impression of a transhuman serenity, self-control, an ability that has gone beyond the superficiality of personal preference and a profound equanimity. The Buddha is often compared to non-human beings, animals, trees, or plants, not because he is subhuman or inhumane, but because he is utterly transcended the selfishness that most of us regard as inseparable from our condition. The Buddha was trying to find a new way of being human. In the West, we prize individualism and self-expression, but this can easily degenerate into mere self-promotion. What we find in Gadarene is a complete invert, taking self-abandonment. He would not have been surprised to learn that the scriptures that present him as a fully rounded personality would have said that our concept of personality was a dangerous illusion. He would have said that there was nothing unique about his life. There have been other Buddhas before him, each of whom delivered the same Dharma and had exactly the same experiences. Buddhist tradition claims there have been 25 such non-human beings, and then after the present historical era, when knowledge is essential truth is faded, the new Buddha Karmana would come to the earth and go through the same life cycle. So strong is this archetypal perception of the Buddha that perhaps the most famous story about him in the Nalakatha, his going forth from his father's house, is said in the Pali Canon to have happened in one of Gautama's predecessors, Buddha Vipassana. The scriptures were not interested in tracing Gautama's unique personal achievements, but in setting forth the path that all Buddhas, all human beings must take when they seek enlightenment. The Buddha was therefore teaching monks and layfolk alike a compassionate offensive to mitigate the egotism that prevailed in the aggressive new society, and that debarred human beings from the sacred dimension of life. The skillful state that he was trying to promote is well expressed in this poem in the Pali Canon. Let all beings be happy, weak or strong, of high, middle, or low estate, small or great, visible or invisible, near or far away, alive or still to be born, may they all be entirely happy. Let nobody lie to anybody or despise any single being anywhere. May nobody wish harm to any single creature out of anger or hatred. Let us cherish all the creatures as a mother only child. May our loving thoughts fill the whole world, above, below, across, without limit, a boundless goodwill to the whole world. Unrestricted, free of hatred and enmity, a lay person who achieved this attitude would have advanced a long way along the spiritual path. Alright, back to teaching of Buddha. Teachings of Buddha. Finding the way. Followers of the way, the one right here before your eyes and listening to the Dharma, is the person who enters fire without being burned, goes in the water without being drowned, and plays about in the three deepest hells as if in a fairground. That person enters the world of hungry spirits, the dumb animals, without being molested by them. Why is this so? Because there's nothing that person dislikes. If you love the sacred and dislike the worldly, you will go on floating and sinking in the ocean of birth and death. The passions arise depending on the heart. If the heart is still, when then do you cease the passions? Do not tire yourselves making up discriminations that go out in of itself, you will find the way. Now let's tie that to the Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita. Okay. Three deepest hells. Three are the gates to this hell, the death of the soul. The gate of lust, the gate of wrath, and the gate of greed. Let a man shun the three. When a man is free from these three doors of darkness, he does what is good for his soul, and then he enters the path supreme. Alright, now for the Upanishads. The student teaches you more of the spiritual wisdom. The teacher, I shall share with you fully what I know. Meditation, control of the senses and passions, and selfless service of all are the body. The scriptures are the limbs, and truth is the heart of this wisdom. Those who realize Brahman shall conquer all evil and attain the supreme state. Truly, they shall attain the supreme state. Shanti, shanti, shanti. World, don't follow wrong laws, don't be thoughtless, don't believe false doctrines, don't follow the way of the world. Wake up, don't be lazy, follow the right path, avoid the wrong. You will be happy here as well as hereafter. Look on the world as a bubble, look on it as a mirage, then the king of death can even see you. Come, look at this world. Is it not like a painted world chariot? The wise see through it, but not the immature. When those who are foolish become wise, they give light to the world like a full moon breaking through the clouds. When their good deeds overcome the bad, they give light to the world like the moon breaking free from behind the clouds. In this dark world, few can see. Like birds that free themselves from the net, only a few find their way to heaven. Swans fly on the path of the sun by the wonderful power. The wise rise above the world of a conquering mariner's train. Okay, Missler, we're going to talk about the sun a little bit. It would be more rational to worship the sun than a spiritual God. Since it was necessary for men to have a god, why did they not have the sun, the visible God adored by so many nations? What being had more right to the homage of mortals than the star of the day, which gives light and heat, which invigorates all beings, whose presence reanimates and rejuvenates nature, whose absence seems to plunder into sadness and languor? If some being bestowed upon men power, activity, benevolent strength, it was no doubt the sun, which should be recognized as the father of nature, as the soul of the world, as divinity. At least one could not without folly dispute his existence, or refuse to recognize his influence and his benefits. He who transgresses the central law of life, who speaks falsely, or scoffs at the life to come, is capable of any evil. Masters do not go to the world of the gods, they do not want to give. The wise are generous to go to a happier world. Better than ruling this world, better than taming the realm of the gods, better than being lord of all the worlds, is one step taken on the path to nirvana. All right, Socrates, hit it. Let's go to the realm of the gods. I got this book from in St. Augustine, along with Confessions. Of Zeus, the author and creator of all these things, you will not tell. For where there is fear, there is also reverence. Now, I disagree with this poet. Shall I tell you in what respect? By all means, I should not say that where there is fear, there is also reverence, for I'm sure that many persons fear poverty and disease and the like evils, but I do not perceive that they reverence the objects of their fear. Very true. But where reverence is, there is fear. For he who has a feeling of reverence and shame about the commission of any action fears and is afraid of an ill reputation, no doubt. Then we are wrong in saying that where there is fear, there is also reverence, and we should say where there is reverence, there is also fear. But there is not always reverence, there is fear, for fear is more extended notion, reverence is a part of fear, just as the odd is a part of number, and number is a more extended notion than the odd. I suppose that you follow me now. Quite well, following the path, all right. So we don't love the world, right? But we love the world, right, Missler? Honor is more solitary and a stronger check than religion. There is scarcely a man who does not fear more what he sees than what he does not see. The judgments of men of which he experiences the effects than the judgments of God, of whom he has but floating ideas. The desire to please the world, the current of custom, the fear of being ridiculed, and what would they say, have more power than all religious opinions. Or with the fear of dishonor, does he not hazard his life in battles every day, even at the risk of incurring eternal damnation? Most religious persons sometimes show more respect for a servant than for God. A man that firmly believes that God sees everything, knows everything, is everywhere, will, when he is alone, commit actions which he never would do in the presence of the meanest of mortals. Those even who claim to be the most firmly convinced of the existence of a God act every instant as if they did not believe anything about it. All right. Now we're going to hop into I've been Epicurean and Captain Wilson. Don't count on the afterlife. What does Superior Croesus ask, invoking the three-headed dog who guarded the gates of hell in ancient mythology and the Furies in a realm destitute of life? These sirs do not exist and cannot exist anywhere at all. One reason for the widespread belief in the immortality of the soul and the existence of an afterlife is that human beings have a strong sense of justice and desert, which in the belief firmly that harms and other people deserve punishment, that superhuman forces will ensure punishment when human forces fail to do so. We suppose that thanks to these powerful forces, what goes around comes around. Most of the world's religions sees explicitly that wrongdoing will always be punished and patient suffering ignorance rewarded. They instruct believers that all undeserved misery be compensated for by happiness or bliss, and all unjust profit and pleasure enjoyed by the wicked in their lifetimes be paid for many times over by their torments. If this does not happen in the course of the individual's life, it must happen in the life or lives who are already accrued through death, reincarnated as animals or babies or angels or inhabitants of heaven or hell. Injustice is thus seen as only a temporary condition that has to be put up with for the time being. Conversely, it seems that if human beings are truly mortal, there's no certainty that justice will be done, unless people believe they cannot get away with their crimes, and definitely they will give free rein to their worst appetites. Epicurean ethics regards society as reasonably effective in maintaining considerate and virtuous behavior thanks to possession of a guilt-inducing conscience and through the punishment of humans by humans. At the same time, the Epicurean recognizes that it is possible to get away with harms to others and that some people are never troubled with conscience because they lack it. There are assaults, murders, and rapes that are never punished because the perpetrator is never identified. There are kidnappings, bank robberies, and high stats, total success from the criminal point of view. Other people can hurt our feelings or our job prospects and steal our mates and never suffer from guilt or social ostracism. Warmongers have caused death painting of spokesman Williams of the happy and ripe old ages, and the rich can exploit the poor economically and keep them in a state of deprivation by controlling politics and our law, again without experiencing the slightest remorse. People who know or believe themselves to be exceptionally clever and powerful do not fear public exposure and punishment. Psychopaths who derive pleasure from manipulating and tormenting their victims do not suffer from regret and guilt. Their assumption that they are unlikely to be caught and punished may be erroneous, but Epicurean considerations are unable to deter them. It may even encourage them if they know they have nothing to fear from the oversight of God or the gods. The Epicurean has accepted the implication that there is serious justice to be done in the long run. No cause for partial sincerity and hope for fear of an afterlife cannot provide sound reasons for living an orderly and innocent life and desisting from crime. Our commitment to morality must rest on a preference for compassion, respect, and fairness. We backed up the desire for approval, generalized as self-approval, and fear of others and the pain of a bad conscience. Justice for the individual has to be secured, if it is to be secured at all in his or her lifetime, preferably when it still matters. And justice for groups of people has to be secured within the lifetime of the group. The great social movements that enacted the 20th century, including the reforms introduced into prisons and workhouses, the abolition of American slavery, and the introduction of labor legislation, were stimulated by the recognition that this life matters because it is the only life any of us will ever have. The expectation of the sufferings of the meek and poor will ever repent in heaven, provided they obey priests and rulers, and the predatory and brutal receive their justice in hell, was no longer sufficiently powerful to justify complacency. Social justice, the reformers realized, was up to human beings themselves, and in particular to those most committed to compassion, respect, and fairness. Alright, so we're going to get on signing here really fast. I do not believe in immortality of the individual, and I consider ethics to be an exclusively human concern with no superhuman authority behind it. I cannot imagine a God who rewards and punishes the objects of his creation, whose purposes are modeled after our own. A God, in short, is but a reflection of human frailty. Neither can I believe that the individual survives the death of his body, although feeble souls harbor such thoughts through fear or ridiculous egotisms. What else did Einstein say? The word God is for me nothing but a product and expression of human weaknesses. A Bible collection of venerable, rather primitive legends. All right. Now time for Zoran Neil Hurston, Destruction on the Road. It seems to me to be true that heavens are placed in the sky because it is the unreachable. The unreachable and therefore the unknowable always seems divine, hence religion. People need religion because the great masses fear life and its consequences. This responsibility is way heavy. Feeling a weakness in the face of great forces means seek an alliance with omnipotence to bolster their feeling of weakness, even though the omnipotence they rely upon is a creature of their own minds, and it gives them a feeling of security. Strong, self-determining men are notorious for the lack of reverence. Constantine, having converted millions of Christianity by his sword, and self-refused the consolation of Christ until his last hour. Some say, not even them. As for me, I do not pretend to read God's mind. If he has a plan of the universe worked out to the smallest detail, it would be folly for me to present to get down on my knees and attempt to revise it. That to me seems the highest form of sacrilege. So I do not pray. I accept the means at my disposal for working out my destiny. It seems to me that I've given a mind, that I've been given a mind and willpower for that very purpose. I do not expect God to single me out and grant me advantages over my fellow men. Prayers for those who need it. Prayer seems to me a cry of weakness, an attempt to avoid by trickery the rules of the game is laid down. I do not choose to admit weakness. I accept the challenge of responsibility. Life as it is does not frighten me, since I made my peace with the universe as I find it, and bow to its laws. Ever sleepless seat in its bed crying out how long the time, Miller informed the never motionless flame. The contemplation of these two aspects alone affords me sufficient food for 10 spans of my expected lifetime. It seems to me that organized creeds are collections of words around a wish. I feel no need for such. As Hitchens would say, wish thinking. However, I would not by word or deed attempt to deprive another the consolation it affords. It is simply not for me. Somebody else may have my rapturous glance at the archangels. The spring of the yellow line of morning out of the misty of dawn is glory enough for me. I know that nothing is destructible, things merely change forms. When the consciousness we know as life ceases, I know that I shall still be part and parcel of the world. I was a part before the sun rolled in the shape and burst forth in the glory of change. I was when the earth was hurled out from its fiery rim. I shall return with the earth the Father's Son, and still exist in substance when the sun has lost its fire, and disintegrated in infinity to perhaps become part of the rolling rubble in space. Why fear? The stuff of my being is matter, ever changing, ever moving, but never lost. So what need denominations and creeds to deny myself the comfort of all my fellow men? The wide built universe has no need for fingerings. I am one with the infinite and need no other assurance. Alright, so that. Infinite, I need no other assurance. Oh, crap, okay. Something after this. Oh, right, okay. Back to Gene Missler. Religion is not necessary to morality and to virtue. We are constantly told that good men and sensible persons come to believe it, that religion is necessary to restrain men. That without it there would be no check upon the people. That morality and virtue are intimately connected with it. The fear of the Lord is, we are told, the beginning of wisdom. The terrors of another life are solitary terrors, incalculated to subdue men's passions. To disabuse us in regard to the utility of religious notions, it is sufficient to open the eyes and to consider what are the morals of the most religious people. We see haughty tyrants, oppressive ministers before the most courtiers, countless extortioners, unscrupulous magistrates, impostors, adulterers, libertines, prostitutes, thieves, and rogues of all kinds who have never doubted the existence of a vindictive God, or the punishments of hell, or the joys of paradise. Although very useless for the majority of men, the ministers of religion had tried to make death appear terrible to the eyes of their votaries. If the most devoted Christians could be consistent, they would pass their whole lives in tears and would follow down the most terrible alarms. But the children of the kingdom shall be cast out in utter darkness. They shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. What is more frightful than death is unfortunate ones who are constantly reminded that it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, that they should seek salvation with fear and trembling. However, we are sure that the Christian's death has great consolation for which the unbeliever is deprived. Fear not, little flock. The good Christian, we are told, dies with a firm hope of enjoying eternal happiness, which he has tried to deserve. Resurrection. But this firm assurance, is it not a punishable presumption in the eyes of a severe God? The greatest saints, are there not be in doubt whether they are worthy of the love or the hatred of God, priests who counsel us with the hope of the joys of paradise, and close your eyes for the torments of hell. Those who see may become blind, the blind will now see. Have you then had the advantage of seeing your names and ours inscribed in the book of life? Religion is the weakest restraint that can be opposed to the passions. To oppose to the passions and present interest in men the obscure notions about a metaphysical God whom no one can conceive of, the incredible punishments of another life, the pleasures of heaven of which we cannot form an idea, is it not combating realities which are mirrors? Men have always but confused ideas of their God. They see him only in the clouds. They never think of him when they wish to do wrong. Whatever ambition, fortune, or pleasure entices them or leads them away, God and his menaces and his promises weigh nothing in the balance. The things of this life have for men of the great certainty, which the most lively faith can never give to the objects of another life. Every religion in its origin was restraint invented by legislators who wished to subjugate the minds of the common people. Like nurses who frighten children or to put them to sleep, ambitious men use the name of the gods to inspire fear in savages. Terror seems well suited to compel them to submit quietly to the yoke which is to be imposed upon them. Or to go stories of childhood fit for mature age. A man in his maturity no longer believes in them. Or if he does, he's showed by little by it and he keeps on his road. Dust tracks on the road. I'll put that on there. Dust tracks on the road. Oh yeah. Bertrand Russell. Up next again. Alright, Bertrand Russell step it back. And the argument for the rimming of injustice. Then there is another very curious form of argument, which is this. They say that the existence of God is required in order to bring justice into the world. In the part of this universe that we know, there is great injustice, and often the good suffer, and often the wicked prosper, and one hardly knows which of those is the more annoying. But if you're going to have justice in the universe as a whole, you have to suppose a future life to adjust the balance of life here on earth. So they said there must be a God, there must be a heaven and hell, and in the long run there may be justice. This is a very curious argument. If you look at the matter from a scientific point of view, you would say, after all, in only this world, I do not know about the rest of the universe, but so far as one could argue in all probabilities, one would say the probability of this world is very sample. And if there's injustice here, the odds are there's injustice elsewhere also. Suppose you got a crate of oranges that you have and you found all the top layer of oranges bad, you would not argue the underneath ones must be good, so there's the rest of the balance. You would say probably the whole lot is a bad consignment, and that is really what a scientific person would argue about the universe. Here's my little addition here. Supposing you got a crate of records, like this when you go to the record store, you go to a record store, you got this record bin here, you're scrolling through the first layer of records, it's all like trash album after trash album after trash album after trash album after trash album. It's, if you're going to get the most bang for your buck, I would just move on to another crate. I wouldn't be like, oh, well, there's got to be some a good album in the back. Or just like, okay, move on to another crate. This is probably just a bunch of bad albums, right? Isn't that what a scientific person would argue about the universe, right? So I would be like, oh, this is like, oh, trash album after trash album after trash album after trash album after trash album. Move on to another crate. Right? He would say, here we find in this world a great deal of injustice, and so far as that goes, that is a reason for supposing that justice is not rule in the world, and therefore, so far as it goes, it affords a moral argument against duty and not in favor of one. Of course, I know that sort of intellectual arguments I've been talking about are not really what moves people. What really moves people to believe in God is not any intellectual argument at all. Most people believe in God because they've been taught from early infancy to do it, and that is the main reason. Then I think that the next most powerful reason is a wish for safety. I sort of feel that there's a big brother who will look after you. That plays a very profound part in influencing people's desire for belief in God. Fear, the foundation of religion. Religion is based, I think, primarily and mainly upon fear. It's partly the unknown, and partly, as I've said, the wish to really have a kind of elder brother who would stand by you on your troubles and disputes. Here's the basis of the whole thing. Fear of the mysterious, fear of defeat, fear of death. Fear is a parent of cruelty, and therefore there's no wonder if cruelty and religion have gone hand in hand. It's because fears are the basis of those two things. In this world, we can now begin a little to understand things, and we'll master the help of science, which is forced its way step by step against the Christian religion, against the churches, and against the opposition of all old precepts. Science can help us to get over the scraping fear in which mankind has lived for so many generations. Science can teach us, and I think our own hearts can teach us, no longer to look around for imaginary supports, no longer to bend eyes in the sky, but rather to look toward efforts here below to make this world a fit place to live in, and so the sort of place that the churches in all these centuries have made it. What we must do. We want to stand upon our own feet and look fair and square at the world. It's good facts, it's bad facts, it's beauties, and it's loveliness. See the world as it is and be not afraid of it. Conquer the world by intelligence and not merely by being slavishly subdued, but the terror that comes from it. The whole conception of God is a conception derived from the ancient Oriental despotism, supernatural dictator. It is a conception quite unworthy of free men. When you hear people in church debasing themselves and saying that they're miserable sinners and all the rest of it, it seems condemnable and not worthy of self-respecting human beings. Excuse me. I must have more self-respect than that. For ourselves and for others. We have to stand up and look the world frankly in the face. We ought to make the best we can of the world, and if it is not so good as we wish, after all, will still be better than what these others have made of it in all these ages. A good world needs knowledge, kindness, and courage. It does not need a regret for hanging out to the past or fronting of the free intelligence by the words uttered long ago by ignorant men. It needs a fearless outlook at a free intelligence. He needs hope for the future, not looking back at a time to the past that is dead, which we trusted before surpassed, but a future that our intelligence can correct. All right, back to hit slap. Imagine they could form a feat of which I am incapable. Imagine, in other words, that you can picture an infinite and an all-powerful creator who conceived you, they made shape you, brought into the world made for you, and now supervises and cares for you even while you sleep. Imagine further that if you obey the rules and commandments that he has lovingly prescribed, you will qualify for an eternally bliss repose. I do not say that I envy this belief because to me it seems like the wish for a horrible form of benevolent and multiple dictatorship. Big Brother is watching you. But I do have a sincere question. Why does such a belief not make its adherents happy? It must seem to them that they come in possession of a marvelous secret of the sort that they can cling to in moments even the most extreme adversity. Now, on to unplay. The tyranny of afterlives. Monotheism, somber vision. Animals, as we know, uncontaminated by God. Excuse from religion and an offering of incense and hosting of lectures and prayers. We do not see them in ecstasy over celestial bodies or priests. They build not cathedrals or temples, and they never cut praying the fictions. Like Spinoza, we imagined that if they created God for themselves, they would create him in their own image. Long ears for donkeys, a trunk for elephants, a sting for bees. Just as men, when they take it to their heads to give birth to one God, do so in their own violent, jealous, vengeful, misogynistic, aggressive, tyrannical, intolerant image. In short, they sculpt their own death and sink their own dark side and make of a machine hold a breakneck speed against themselves. For only men have been afterlives gods or a single God. Only men prostrate themselves, humble themselves, abase themselves, weave fables and believe unquestioningly the tales they so painstakingly concocted in order to avoid looking at fate in the face. Only men extract from this fiction of delirium that draws in the swine of welter and dangerous nonsense and new ways out. They alone work passionately bring about what they nevertheless hope more than anything else to avoid. death. Does life with death as its inevitable ending seem on level to them? So with the responding range matters of the enemy governs our lives. This is done little by little, systematically, day by day, so when the hour strikes, death will seem less difficult. The three monotheistic religions call their faithful to renounce life in the here and now because they one day be forced to accept this loss. The glorification of the fictional beyond prevents full enjoyment of the real here below. And what motivates them? The death instinct, the unceasing variations on that theme. An extraordinary paradox. Religion is a response to the ontological void apparent to everyone who learns that he will one day die, that is sojourner is finite, that each life constitutes a brief interlude between a nothingness that came before it and a nothingness that comes after it. Fables only accelerate the process. They establish death on earth for the sake of eternity in heaven. In so doing, this only gift we possess, a living matter of potential existence, killing the egg just because its life is finite. Fleeing life in order not to have to die is not a good bargain. It pays death twice and once is enough. Religion proceeds from the death wish. That strange, dark corpse in the depths of our being works for destruction of what is. Wherever life begins to move, stand vibrate, a countercurrent sets in, turns into an arrested movement, and immobilizes even flow. As soon as life finds its way to the tunnel, death is there, where to start the clock ticking. That is its function, its endless operandi, and to collapse all life's hopes and plans. Being born is also the process of dying. Living for death means counting off one by one the days of our life while waiting to die. Religion alone seems to halt the mechanism, when in fact it speeds it up. Turn against ourselves, the fixation with death generates every kind of risky behavior, suicidal impulse, and self-destructive conduct. Directed against others, it triggers aggression, violence, crimes, murders. The religion of the one God exposes these impulses. It seeks to promote self-hatred to the detriment of the body, to discredit the intelligence, and despise the flesh, and prize everything that sins or whatever gratified subjectivity. It also against others, it foments content, wickedness, forms of intolerance that produce racism, xenophobia, colonialism, war, social injustice. A glance at history is enough to confirm the misery and the rivers of bloodshed in the name of the one God. Fired by the same inborn death drive, the three monotheism share a series of identical forms of aversion: hatred of reason and intelligence, hatred of freedom, hatred of all books in the name of one book alone, hatred of sexuality, women, and pleasure, hatred of the feminine, hatred of the body, of desires, of drives. Instead, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is still faith to believe. Obedience and submission, taste for death and longing for the beyond, the asexual angel and chasticity, virginity and monogamous love, wife and mother, soul and spirit, in other words, life crucified, and nothingness exalted. And the part where that ties into Nietzsche, like I said, this is what I have to say to the person on Goodreads. If you don't like Nietzsche, you won't like Offred, because that ties in perfectly to Nietzsche right here. Antichrist. The conception of God, the Christian conception of God, God as God of the sick, God as spider, God as spirit, is one of the most corrupt conceptions of God arrived at on earth. Perhaps it even represents the low water mark in the descending development of the God type. God degenerated to the contradiction of life, instead of being its transfiguration and eternal yes. And God, a declaration of hostility towards life, nature, the will to life. God, the formula for every culminant of this world, for every lie about the next world. And God, nothingness deified, the will to nothingness sanctified. Christianity also stands in opposition to all intellectual well-constitutiveness. It can use only the morbid mind as a Christian mind. It takes the side of everything idiotic and proclaims a curse against the spirit of the healthy spirit. Because sickness belongs to the essence of Christianity, the typical Christian condition faith has to be a form of sickness. Every straightforward, honest, scientific word of knowledge has to be repudiated by the church as a forbidden road. Even the doubt is a sin. The complete lack of psychological cleanliness of the priest. It betrays itself in his glance as a consequent phenomenon of decadence. One can observe in hysterical women and raggedy children how regular instinctive falsity, lying for the sake of lying, individual luxury, not trade, are expressions of decadence. Faith means not wanting to know what is true. The pietist, the presupposes sex is false because he is sick. His instinct demands that truth shall not come unto its own at any point. What makes sick is good, what proceeds from abundance, from superfluity, from power is evil. That is what the believer feels. Compulsion to lie, that a detective or predestined theologian. Another mark of the theologian is his incapacity for philology. Philology is to be understood here in a very wide sense as art of reading well, being able to read off a fact without falsifying it by interpretation, without losing caution, patience, and desire for understanding. Philology is of excess and decisiveness in interpretation, or to be a question of books, newspaper reports, fate of the weather. They say nothing in the salvation of the soul. The way in which a theologian, no matter whether in Berlin or in Rome, interprets the word of the scriptures and experience a victorious country's armor, for example, out of the high illumination of the Psalms of David, is always so audacious as to make a philologist run up everyone's sight. And what on earth is he to do when pietists and other cows out of Swabia dress up the pathetic commonplace and selfness of their existence with the finger of God? It's a miracle of grace, a divine providence of experience of salvation. No need for finger rings, right, Zoroaster? Yet, the most moderate experience of intelligence, not the safe decency, would convince these interpreters of the complete childishness and unworthiness of such an abuse of divine dexterity. Even the slightest trace of piety in us ought to make us feel that even the slightest trace of piety in us ought to make us feel that a God's occurs head called the right moment, or tells us to get to a church as the downpours about to start, It's so absurd a God who would have to be abolished even if he existed. A God is a domestic servant, as a postman, as an almanac maker. At bottom, a word for the simplest kind of accidental occurrence. Divine providence is still believed that today by almost every third person in culture of Germany will be a stronger objection to God than any other that could possibly be thought of. And in any case, it is an objection to the Germans. Back to On Frame. Seeking the opposite of the real. Inventing the afterlife. This is also an objection to the French. Monotheisms have no love for intelligence, books, knowledge, science. Referring the ethereal of the material in the real, they have a strong aversion to man's instincts and basic drives. Thus, not only do they celebrate ignorance, innocence, naivety, obedience, and submission, the three religions of the book disdain the textual forms and forces of the world. The hero now is irrelevant, for the whole world now and forever bears the weight of original sin. Get ready for the millennium. Solving the woman problem, she would discern the logical consequence of hatred for intelligence and hatred for women common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. According to the holy books, original sin, error, desire for knowledge, all stem from the decision of one woman, Eve. Adam, what is an innocent fool, content to obey and submit. When the serpent speaks, nothing wrong with that, the snakes speak. He addresses the woman's social dialogue with her. In the Quran, the temple is called Odyssey attained for centuries, millions of ones from reformed the ritual sending of the devils, part of the annual pilgrimage to Mecca. Seducing a serpent leads to seduce woman, leads a woman to eternal temptress. It is an easy progression. Hatred of women is like a variation of the theme of hatred of intelligence, which might be added hatred of everything women represent for men, desire, pleasure, life, curiosity as well. Many dictionaries confirm that inquisitive women are why they dismiss as daughters of Eve. They generate desire, they also generate life. Original sin is perpetuated through women. That sin, which is St. Augustine assures us, is transmitted from the moment of conception in the mother's womb via the father's sperm, the sexualization of sin. Now back to Bertrand Russell. Guess there's nothing new in that book, right? Goodreads commenter. Nothing new in that book that wasn't already said by Bertrand Russell. So it's tired of Bertrand Russell. Christianity, but however, he did add on St. Augustine there. There's some new things in there. So he's just a lot. You'll find that Bertrand Russell is a central theme with atheism, but it's not exactly the same. But he takes a lot of the things that Bertrand Russell said and expands upon it. I disagree with that Goodreads comment. I keep bringing it up just to show that I listen to y'all. Christianity and sex. The worst feature of the Christian religion, however, is its attitude towards sex. An attitude so morbid, so natural that can be understood only when taken in relation to the sickness of the civilized world at the time the Roman Empire was decaying. We sometimes hear taught to the effect that Christianity improved the status of women. This is one of the grossest perversions of history that it is possible to make. Women cannot enjoy a tolerable position in society where it is considered of utmost importance that they should not infringe a very rigid moral code. Most have always regarded women primarily as a temptress. They have thought of her mainly as inspired of impure lust. The teaching of the church has been and still is that virginity is best, but that for those who find this impossible, marriage is permissible. It is better to marry than to burn, as St. Paul brutally puts it. Now, I have to add on to this. That is the King James Version error. Because the other ones say to burn with passion. Now, the gracious Son nature of the universe. Do not think that by avoiding romantic love, you're missing the lights of sex. Rather, you're reaping the sort of profits that carry with them no penalty. Rest assured that this pleasure is enjoyed in the pure form by the sane than by the love sick. Lovers' passion is storm tossed, even in the moment of possession by waves of delusion and incertitude. They cannot make up their mind what to enjoy first with eye or hand. They clasp the object of their longing so tightly that the embrace is painful. They kiss so fiercely that teeth are driven into lips. All this because the pleasure is not pure, but they are good about an underlying impulse to hurt the thing, whatever it may be, that gives rise to these budding shoots of madness. In the actual presence of love, Venus gives a slight break in the penalty she imposed, and her scenes exasperate by an animation of her learning pleasure. For in love, there is the hope that the flame of passion may be quenched by the same body that kindled it. But this runs clean counter to the course of nature. This is one thing of which the more we have, the more our breast burns with the evil lust of having. Food and fluid are taken to our bodies since they can fill their allotted places. The desire for meat and drink is thus easily appeased. But a pretty face or a pleasing complexion gives the body nothing to enjoy but insubstantial images, which all too often pathetic love scatters to the winds. So it's better to marry in the burden with passion is what other translations say, but the King James Version just says it's better to marry and burn, and that causes misconceptions. However, you can still complain about this and be like, wait, so if I can't control my passions, I rush into marriage? I don't think that's a good way to deal with lust either. Food for thought for you. You know, worse than a swine. Jumping in, drowning yourself. Oh my gosh. Can't control my passions, I gotta rush into marriage. You know, that's my complaint there. Okay, where were we? That's right. It's better than married than the burn, as St. Paul brutally puts it. By making marriage indissoluble, by stepping on all knowledge of the horrors of many, the church did what it could, thus secured to the only form of sex which permitted should involve very little pleasure and a great deal of pain. The opposition to birth control has, in fact, the same motive. If a woman has a child at a year till she dies worn out, it is not to be supposed that she derive much pleasure from her married life. Therefore, birth control must be discouraged. The conception of sin, which is bound up with Christian ethics, is one that doesn't ensure no amount of harm, since it forces people out for the sadism which they believe to be legitimate and even noble. Take, for example, the question of prevention of syphilis. Those who know that by precautions taken in advance, the danger of contracting this disease can be made negligible. Christians, however, object to the dissemination of knowledge of this fact, since they hold it good that sinners should be punished. They hold this so good that even one that punishment should extend to the wives and children of sinners. There are in the world at the present moment many thousands of children suffering from congenital syphilis who have never been born but for the desires of Christians to see so punished. I cannot understand how Dawkins I, as Venus cruelty can be considered to have any good effects on our morals. Speaking of Luna, I think syphilis, right? I don't know. My friend likes all the boss, so I keep bringing her up here. It is not only in regard to sexual behavior, but also in regard to knowledge on sex subjects that the attitude of Christians is dangerous to human welfare. Every person who's taken the trouble to study the question on by the spirit knows the artificial ignorance on sex subjects, which Orthodox Christians attempt to force upon the young, is extremely dangerous to mental and physical health, and causes those people up their knowledge by the way of improper talk, as most children do, an attitude that sex is in itself indecent and ridiculous. I do not think there could be any defensive view that knowledge is ever undesirable. I should not put barriers in the way of the acquisition of knowledge by anybody at any age, but in the particular case of sex knowledge, there are much weightier arguments in this favor in the case of understanding knowledge. A person is much less likely to act wisely when he's ignorant and is instructed. It is ridiculous to give young people the sin because they're not curiosity about an important matter. So apparently, when I have syphilis or something, that's why they're out there. I don't know if that's true, whatever, that might be wrong. I have no idea. So every boy is interested in trains. Suppose we told him that an interest in trains is wicked. Those who see may become blind. Suppose we kept his eyes bandaged whenever he's in a train on a railway station. The blind will now see. Suppose we never allowed the word train to be mentioned in his presence to preserve an impenetrable mystery as to the means by which he is transported from one place to another. The result would not be that he would cease to be interested in trains. On the contrary, he would become more interested than ever, but have a morbid sense of sin, because his interests have been represented as improper. Every boy of active intelligence could, by this means, be rendered the greater or less degree neurasthenic. This is precisely what is done in the matter of sex, but if sex is more interested in trains, the results are worse. Almost every adult in a Christian community is more or less diseased nervously, or as a result, on the type of sex knowledge when he or she was young. And the sense of sin which is thus artificially impounded is one of the causes of cruelty, timidity, and stupidity in later life. There's no rational ground of any sort of kind for keeping a child ignorant of anything that he may wish to know, whether on sex or any other matter. And we shall never get the same population of those factors recognized in education, which is impossible so long as the tertiary is able to control educational politics. Let us look next at the question of knowledge on sexual subjects, which arises at the earliest age and is the least difficult and doubtful of the various problems with which we are concerned. There is no sound reason of any sort of kind for concealing facts from talking to children. The question should be answered in curiosity satisfied exactly the same way in regard to sex as in regard to habits, efficiency, and other subject interests them. There should be no sentiment because young children cannot feel as adults do, and see no occasional powerful talk. It is a mistake to begin with the loves of the bees and the flowers. There's no point in leading up to the facts of life by devious routes. The child who is told what he wants to know and allowed to see his parents naked will have no appearance of no sexual and sexual kind. Boys who are brought up in official ignorance, they can talk much more about sex, and boys have always heard this topic treated on a level with any other. Official ignorance and actual knowledge seems to be deceitful and hypocritical with their others. On the other hand, real ignorance with his cheese is likely to be a source of shock and anxiety and to make adaptation of life difficult. All ignorance is regrettable, but ignorance on so important a matter as sex is a serious danger. When I say that children should be told about sex, I do not mean that they should be told only the bare physiological facts. They should be told whatever they wish to know. There should be no attempt to represent adults as more virtuous than they are as sex is occurring only in marriage. There's no excuse for deceiving children, and when that's what's happening in conventional families, they find that their parents have lied, they lose confidence in them and feel justified in lying to them. There are facts which are intrude upon a child, but I would tell many things sooner than say what is not true. Virtue which is based upon a falsehood of the facts is not real virtue. Speaking not only from theory but from practical experience, I'm convinced that complete openness on sexual subjects is the best way to prevent children from thinking about them excessively, nastily, or unwholesomely, and also the almost indispensable preliminary to enlightened sexual morality. Where adult sexual behavior is concerned, it is by no means easy to arrive at a rational compromise between the antagonistic considerations of each strong validity. The fundamental difficulty is, of course, the conflict between the impulse of jealousy and the impulse of sexual variety. Another impulse that is true is universal. There are those, although there are few, who are never jealous, and there are those among men as well as among women whose affections never wander from the prudent partner. If all these types can be made universal, it would be easy to devise a satisfactory code. It must be made however that a type can be made more common by conventions designed to that end. Much ground remains to be covered by a complete sexual ethic, but I don't think we can say anything very positively or more explicit with the effects of various systems and changes resulting from rational education matters sex. It is clear that marriage is an institution only interests the state because of children. It should be viewed as a purely private matter so long as it is childless. It is clear also that even where there are children, the state is only interested in it as a father's wish to achieve financial. Where divorce is easy, as is given, the children usually go with the mother, so the patriarchal family tends to disappear. If, as is increasingly habitable wage earners are concerned, the state takes over foods that have hitherto fallen upon fathers, marriage will cease to have no reason to deter, and will probably be no longer customary except among the rich and religious. If you're rich or you're really religious, yeah, sure, okay. In the meantime, it would be well if men and women could remember in sexual relations and marriage and divorce to practice the ordinary virtues of tolerance, kindness, truthfulness, and justice. Those who, by conventional standards, are sexually virtuous too often consider themselves thereby absolved or behaving like decent human beings. Most moralists have been so obsessed by sex that they have laid. Get it? That they have laid much too little emphasis on other, more socially useful kinds of ethically commendable conduct. Alright, enough of that sex thought. Socrates. Above all, I shall then be able to continue my search on the true and false knowledge, as in this world, so also in the next, shall I find out who is wise and pretends to be wise and is not. What would not a man give my judges to be able to examine the leader of the great Trojan expedition, or Odysseus, or Sisyphus, or numerous others men and women too? What infinite delight would be in conversing with them and asking them questions? In another world that did not put a man to death for asking them questions, is surely not. For besides being happier than we are in other ways, there will be immortal if what we are told is true. In you too, my judges must regard death hopefully, must know for certainty that no evil can happen to a good man either in life or after death. He and his is not neglected by the gods, nor is moan approaching and having only a chance. But it's clear that the time of arrival is better for me to die and relieve some trouble. That is what the oracle gave me no sign. For the same reason also, I'm not angry with my condemners or my accusers. They have done me no harm, although they do not mean to do me any good. For this, I may blame them. Still, I have a favor to ask you then. When my friends' sons are grown up, I would ask you, my friends, to punish them, and I would have you trouble them as I have troubled you if they see they care about riches or anything more than about virtue, or they pretend to be something when they're really nothing. Then reprove them as I reprove you for not caring for what they ought and for thinking that they're something when they're really nothing. And if you do this, both I and my sons will receive justice at your hands. The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways. I to die and you to live. Which is better, God only knows. Now, Epictetus. How we should behave to tyrants. If a man possesses any superiority and thinks that he does when he does not, such a man, if he is an instructable necessity, be puffed up through it. For instance, the tyrant says, I am master of all, and what can you do for me? Can you give me the desire which shall have no hindrance? How can you have you the infallible power of avoiding what you would avoid? Have you the power of moving toward an object without error? And how do you possess this power? Come, we are in a ship. To who do you trust? To yourself or to the helmsman? And when you are in a church, to whom do you trust but to the driver? And how is it in all other arts? Just the same. And with the knowledge of power, all men pay respect to me. Will also pay respect to my plight, and I wash it and wipe it for the sake of my oil flask, I drive a peg into the wall. Will then these things appear to me? No, but they supply someone once. For this reason I take care of them. Well, then I attend to my ass, and I wash his feet, though not clean them. Do you not know that every man has regard to himself, and to you just the same as regard to his ass? First regard to you as a man. Show me. Who wishes to become like you? Who imitates you as he imitates Socrates? But I call for you, you say, right? I have forgotten this one, that I must have regard to you, as I would to a fever in the bottle, and there is an also you, as there is in Rome, and also the fever. Alright. Now, Rousseau, the social contract. It will be said that a despot gives his subjects the assurance of civil tranquility. Very well. But what does it profit them if those wars against other powers which result from a despot's ambition, if his insatiable greed and the press of the demands of his administration cause more desolation than civil strife would cause? What do the people gain if the very condition of civil tranquility is one of their hardships? There is peace in dungeons, but is it enough to make dungeons desirable? The Greeks have the peace in the cave of Cyclops of when to turn to be devoured. To speak of a man giving himself in return for nothing is to speak of what is absurd, unthinkable. Such an act would be illegitimate, void, if only because no one who did it could be in his right mind. To say the same of a whole people is a condemnation of lunatics, and right cannot rest on madness. Alright, beyond good and evil. Madness is rare in individuals. But in groups, parties, nations, and ages, it is the rule. To our strongest drive, the tyrant in us, no matter reason battles with our short conscience. Alright. Models. Is Socrates' irony an expression of revolt, of the resentment of the rabble? Does he, as one of the oppressed, enjoy his own form of ferocity in the ninth thrust of the syllogism? Does he revenge himself on the aristocrats he fascinates? As a dialectician, one is in possession of the pitiless instrument, With its aid, one can play the tyrant. One compromises by conquering. The dialectician leaves it to his opponent to demonstrate he is not an idiot. He enrages at the same time, makes helpless. The dialectician revitalizes his opponent's intellect. What? Is dialectic some form of revenge in the case of Socrates? I have intimated the way in which Socrates could repel this. Therefore, all the more necessary to explain the fact that he exercised fascination, that he discovered a new kind of agony, that he was the first fencing master for the aristocratic circles of Athens is one reason. He fascinated because he touched on the agal instinct of Hellenes. He introduced a variation to the wrestling matches among the youths and young men. Socrates is also a great erotic. But Socrates divined even more. He saw behind his aristocratic Athenians. He grasped his case, idiosyncrasy of his case was already no longer exceptional. The same kind of degeneration was everywhere silently repairing itself. The old Athens was coming to an end, and Socrates understood that all the world had need of him. His expedient, his cure, his personal self-preservation. Everywhere the instincts were in anarchy. Everywhere people were about 5 steps from excess. The march of an enemy was the universal danger. The instincts want to play the tyrant. Must have as a counter-tyrant who was stronger. When that Physiognomus had revealed to Socrates what he was, it gave of every evil lust. The great ironess of the phrase that provides him. That is sure he said, but they have become master of them all. How does Socrates become master of himself? His case was, after all, only the extreme case of one of the most obvious instances that would at that time begun to be the universal exigency. That no one was any longer master of himself. That the instincts were becoming mutually antagonistic. He exercised fascination as his extreme case. His spirit-inspiring ugliness, especially for every eye to see. He fascinated even more because, without saying, as the answer as his illusion as the apparent cure for this case. If one needs to make a turn of reason, as Socrates did, then there must exist no little danger of something else playing the tyrant. Rationality was at that time defined as a savior. Now the Socrates and his invalids are free to be rational or not as they wish. It was the rigor, it was the last expedient. The fanaticism which a whole Greek thought proves itself a rationality betrays a state of emergency. One was in peril, one had only one choice, either perish or be absurdly rational. Moralism, the Greek philosophers from Plato downwards, is pathologically conditioned. Likewise, our estimation of dialectics. Reason equal virtue, because happiness means merely one must imitate Socrates and the dark desires by producing a permanent daylight, the daylight of reason. One must be prudent, clear, brighter than he calls ever yield into the instincts and unconscious leads downwards. I have intimated the way in which Socrates exercised fascination. He seemed to be a physician, a savior. Is it necessary to go on the point of the error which led his faith in rationality and the costs? It is self-deception on the part of philosophers and moralists to imagine that by making one decadence, they therewith elude decadence themselves. This is beyond their powers. What they select as an expedient, as a deliverance, is itself only another expression of decadence. The also is expression, then abolishes thing itself. Socrates was a misunderstanding. The entire morality of improvement, the Christian included, is but a misunderstanding. The harshest daylight, rationality and the costs. Life, bright, cold, circumspect, conscious, without instinct, in opposition to the instincts, has itself been no more than a form of sickness. Another form of sickness, and by no means way about the virtue, health, and happiness. That to combat one's instincts as a formula for decadence, as long as life is ascending, happiness and instinct are one. Did he himself grasp at the truths of all self-deceivers? Did he at last say it to himself in the wisdom of his courage for death? Socrates wanted to die, was not Athens, but he who handed himself the poison cup, about Athens to hand him the poison cup. Socrates is no physician. He said softly to himself, death alone is a physician. Here, Socrates himself has only been a long time sick. The sickness unto death. Alright, the sickness unto death. Well, this isn't the sickness unto death, but you get what I mean. Here we go. Here's Søren Kierkegaard. Socrates was an intellectual tragic hero. He hears his death sentence. That instant he dies. Unless you grasp that it requires all the strength of the spirit to die, that the hero always dies before his death, you will not come particularly far in your observations on life. So as a hero, Socrates was required to stay calm and at ease, but as an intellectual hero, he is required to have sufficient spiritual strength to find a moment to fulfill himself. So he cannot, like the ordinary tragic hero, concentrate on keeping himself face to face to death. He has to make this latter movement so quickly that in the same instant he is consciously above that conflict and continues to assert himself. Had Socrates been sought in the crisis of death, he would have weakened the effect of his life, aroused the suspicion that the resilience of irony was not in him a imperative strength. Though only a game, his flexibility had to exploit in a decisive moment, according to an opposite standard, pathetically to sustain himself. Which of Socrates' remarks is to be regarded as decisive one could be a matter of controversy. Since Socrates has been in so many ways politically related to lies by Plato, I suggest the following. The death sentence is announced to him that instant he dies and fulfills himself in the famous rejoinder that he was surprised to have been condemned with a majority of 3 votes. He could have found no more ironic jest in some marketplace flippancy or fool's inanity than this comment on the death sentence, which condemns him from life itself. Back to Carl Jaspers. The trial. The life of Socrates was not dramatic except for its end. His trial for blasphemy ended with a death sentence. This outcome was no accident. Long history led up to it. And the clause 423, Aristophanes portrays Socrates as engages in natural philosophy, consumes himself with celestial phenomena and things under the earth. The knowledge of traditional gods for which he substitutes the air in the clause teaches the art of arguing and calls even if it's unjust, he takes money for his teaching. Well, the exact opposite of Socrates as we know him. Since then, new accusations have been raised. He was accused of teaching young men all this, of being basing criminal actions on the interpretation of the poets, of numbering such enemies as the people of Archimedes and Critias among his students. What gave rise to this astonishingly false picture? As a young man, to be sure, he had concerned himself with natural philosophy and sophism, but above all, he was regarded as a representative of the whole new philosophical movement, which was opposed by public opinion. The people confused a man who had transcended sophism with sophism itself, for the new method by which he refuted it was intolerable. Socrates questioned unremittingly. He drove his listeners to the basic problems of man, but did not solve them. Confusion, consciousness of inferiority, and the demands he raised, created anger and hatred. One such reaction is that of Hippias. For you always mock at others, questioning, examining everybody, and never willing to run on account of yourself or to stand opinion on anything Xenophon. So Socrates, in the year 999, was tried on charges of violating the laws, for he does not believe in the gods of our country, of observing and a faith in a new kind of demon, and of leading youth astray. Socrates seems to have ignored these accusations for years, as long as he lived. There was no literature in defense of his philosophy. He himself never wrote a line. He had not withdrawn the aristocratic seclusion nor limited his teaching to a select coterie, but had taught in the streets and marketplace in full public view. Even though he conversed only with individuals, he let the Athenians know peace. The god, says Socrates, and this is the main point in his defense, had been to spend his life delving into himself and other men. I shall obey the god rather than you, and while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice of philosophy. Is there anyone whom I meet and say to him after my manner, you, my friend, are you not ashamed to care so little about wisdom and truth and the greatest improvement of the soul, which you never regard or heed at all? And his defense turns into an attack on the judges. For if you kill me, declares, you will not easily find another like me, who, if I may use such a ludicrous figure of speech, am a sort of gadfly given to the city by God, always fastening upon you, arousing, persuading, and reproaching you. But you may feel out of temper, like a person suddenly wakened from sleep and might strongly strike me dead, and then sleep on for the remainder of your lives. His death, more than anything else, fashioned an image of Socrates that passed into tradition. He's a martyr of philosophy, a victim of judicial murder at the hands of the Athenian democracy. Yet some have questioned this combination of his judges. Darwin is roughly as follows. Socrates might easily have saved himself by offering the right kind of defense. In overweening defiance of human authority, he insulted his judges. He was often a number of ways out and failed to take advantage of them. He might easily have avoided execution by escaping. He refused to make his peace with the unwritten conventions in the community. He willfully brought about his own death. Hence, it was not a judicial murder, but a judicial suicide. Those who take such a view hold that not the murder, but the victim was guilty, fail to see this divine mission to work for the truth, forbade Socrates to lose himself in servile acceptance of the prevailing untruth. He was a true martyr, as I say, witness. These arguments against his thesis of a judicial murder are of interest for our judgment, not of Socrates, but of the reader of the Socratic text. Like everything Socrates did, his defense presents dangers to our understanding. It is valid only in conjunction with this philosophy. Considering the abstract, it teaches the reader a false attitude of revolt, defiance, that wrong kind of edifaction. Instead of entering into Socrates' fundamental state of mind, he rid himself by involuntarily regarding Socrates as presumptuous, becomes arrogant and presumptuous himself. He derives pleasure from what he takes for an insult to people and the judges. He makes the mistake of deriving universal rules from Socrates' apology, of making an abstract model. Only one who thought like Socrates could, without falsehood, act and die like Socrates. Even Plato would not have died like Socrates. Another view is that first presented by Hegel. Athens is right for his defending its substance. Socrates is right for his ushering in a new era which presupposes the destruction of that substance. Such absolutizing of history and aesthetic objectification of attractive conflicts is utterly inappropriate in events such as Socrates. Of course, each era has its own spirit, and immense transformations have taken place from era to era. But this does not mean that each era has its own absolute justice, and that consequently there are many justices. Through all the eras, when something that is valid for men is men. What men do stands before a higher court than that of history. What is true and good, what is false of all, ought not to be veiled or exercised as tragedy. It is only through Socrates himself that we can reconcile ourselves to his death. He died without defiance or blame. I'm not angry with my condemners or my accusers. This was his last word. He was convinced that for a good man there could be no evil. His calls would not be neglected by the gods. But his next to last words were, I tell you who have killed me, that immediately after my departure, punishment will come upon you. There will be more accusers of you than there are now, accusers whom hitherto I restrain. And as they're young, they will be more inconsiderate with you and more dangerous. If you think that by killing men you can prevent someone from censoring your evil lies, you are mistaken. And that is where I will end this live stream. Wow, that was a long time, wasn't it, folks? That's the end. But if you would like to see more of the Philosophy Odyssey, comment, let me know. I figured this would be like the only one I do, because there you go, there's just a bunch of books tossed at you. So yeah, I'm just going to end it there. I hope you all have a great rest of your night or day, wherever you are, and take care. All right, time to end up. So